I'm going to be doing this by slideshow, so I'm going to try to put my slideshow on right now, and all of you should be able to see it. Everybody see the slides? I don't have it on the correct. Okay, what am I missing here? Here we go. There we go. Everybody see that all right? The slideshow, good. Okay, so obviously we're here to talk about the life of Shaul. That's how I'm going to call Paul, since I feel a little more at home with his Hebrew name than his English one. So I'll call him Shaul. And I think Shaul happens to be probably the most misunderstood author of certainly the Bible, but as well, one of the most misunderstood persons in the history of mankind. At least who's as famous and is read as often as Shaul's writings are. When I became a believer in Yeshua, I was 19 years old, so that was many gray hairs ago. You can tell it was a while back. And I came to I'd never read Shaul before. So I become a believer and I begin to study the Newer Testament writings. And I heard so much about Shaul's teachings, and as I'm reading them, it was really hard to make sense of it. Not only are his writings a bit complicated, but you remember Peter, or Shimon as his Hebrew name is, once commented about Shaul's writings that they were difficult for him to understand. So if they were difficult for him to understand, how much more are they difficult for us? And it was especially difficult because as a Jewish believer in Yeshua that I am, many of my friends who are believers in Yeshua as well who are not Jewish, and that would be most of them, said to me things like, you can't live the way you are because Shaul teaches you should live like this and like this, and you don't any longer have to honor the Torah of Moses because Shaul writes that it's canceled. And so as I began to study those readings of Shaul, they were confusing to me. So I went on a rather long search over the past few years to try and understand his writings. And I think what has helped me more than anything is just to understand his background. If we can understand his background, that gives us a lot of insight into his writings. So what we're going to do today, we're not going to do a verse by verse study of anything, but we're going to look at his background and ask the question, how is it best to understand him? So like my first slide says here, Shaul, world famous throughout the ages, and he has been, but no doubt he's been very misunderstood. So we're going to try to understand him today by first understanding the world he grew up in and how that formed his mind and his thoughts. So first of all, as a young Jewish believer, I asked the question, okay, is he Paul or is he Shaul? What name should he be called by? How did he look at himself? Was he the man from Tarsus? We call him Paul of Tarsus. Or was he from Jerusalem? Because he said that he grew up there. Was he a Pharisee or was he an ex-Pharisee? Did he give all that up when he became a believer in Yeshua? Who was he? Because I got two very different pictures of what he could be, and I wanted to know who he was. So we're going to look at his biography, including a little of his own autobiographical comments. We'll look at his family background, his education. We'll look a little at how the book of Acts describes him. We'll look at relevant parts of letters that he wrote, in other words, Newer Testament writings of his. And then we'll re-ask and revisit our question of who he was. And that will give us, I think, some ground on which to understand him. Now, why is all this important? Again, if we have a better understanding of who he was and the world he grew up in, we'll better understand what's written about him and what he wrote, because it's all connected. For example, I like to use this as an example. In 100 years from now, you might find a letter that my father wrote to me, and you'll be able to understand part of it. But if you understand, like I do, the world my father grew up in, and if you had lived with him like I did and could, know who he was, you're going to understand that letter a whole lot better. And so what I like to do with Shaul is try to understand those questions. What was the world like he grew up in? What did he experience to help us know who he was? Now, I don't mean to sell my book online, and I'm not trying to do that here, but I am saying this, that I wrote a book that looks at who he was, and everything that we'll be talking about today is talked about in greater detail in my book. My book is called At the Feet of Rabbi Gamliel. It's only 100 pages long. It's a paperback. There's information that you can order it on if you're interested. It might be fun to read the book after today, because it's going to reemphasize some of the same things. So if you're interested, it's only 9 or 10 American dollars on Amazon.com. So it's not that much, but I do recommend it. I'll recommend some more books at the end as well that I didn't write. So you can't accuse me of trying to make a profit off of you. Okay, so today you're going to see my perspective of who Shaul was. We're only going to scratch the surface due to our limited time. So what I would encourage you to do is just listen, take it in, save your questions till the end, and then we'll have time to ask them. Extra biblical sources describe what Shaul looked like. I always like to try and imagine what a person looked like who I'm reading about. So here's what we do have. It states this: he was a man of small stature, meaning he was short, with a bald head and crooked legs, in a good state of body, meaning he was physically fit, with eyebrows meeting and nose somewhat hooked. This is from a writing called the Acts of Paul, which is from about the year 160 AD, so about 100 years after he died. In the Latin version of the Acts of Paul, it's added that he had a red, florid face, like you might see in the depiction of him at the lower part of the bottom of your screen, kind of red cheeks, they're saying. So he, as far as we know, is short, bald, bold-egged, and in good physical condition. Now, it should be that we would expect that, because if you just look at the book of Acts, and this is beside what he might have done as a young man, as he's walking, typically as people did in those days, he walked over 10,000 miles in his lifetime. That's some 14,000 kilometers. That's the distance if you're walking from Jerusalem, Israel, to Cape Town in the Republic of South Africa and back. Or from, if this was possible, to walk over the ocean from Jerusalem, Israel to Boston, Massachusetts in the USA and back, which is an incredible amount of walking during his lifetime. So it shouldn't surprise us that he was physically fit. Now let's talk about his name for a minute. Shaul is his given Hebrew name, and he was probably named after a relative, or perhaps King Shaul, King Saul in the Bible, because like King Saul, our Shaul here was from the tribe of Benjamin. So was King Saul. And it's very typical for Jewish families to name their children after people who they had descended from, especially of biblical fame. So he mentions to us in Philippians chapter 3, verse 5, he's from the tribe of Benjamin. Now, in the Western world, we usually call him by his Greek name, which was Paul. So why does he have two names? Why is it Shaul? Why is it Paul, which was the real name? Which one was his real name, I'm asking. Jewish babies were given two names in the first century diaspora. And diaspora means Jewish life outside of the land of Israel. One would have been their Hebrew name, their Jewish name, and the second was their diaspora land name. So, and in fact, our friends from India here right now might understand that. I knew a lot of Indian immigrants to the United States when I grew up in the United States, and typically they would have a name that was native in India, which would have been difficult for an English speaker to pronounce. So quite often they also gave themselves an English name, which saved their Indian name from being mispronounced all the time, and just was easier for a typical American to call them. So this was the situation as well for Jewish people back at this time. So Shaul was Shaul when he was with his family and with his Jewish community in Tarsus and in Israel, where he was in a Jewish environment. Paul would have been used as his name among Greek-speaking communities. And when he was in Athens and Corinth, he probably would have been known as Paul, because they were Greek-speaking countries. We find him there in the book of Acts. And when writing to Greek-speaking areas like Thessalonica and Philippi, he calls himself in his letters Paul. And even today, Jewish babies in the diaspora, that is, who are born outside of Israel, are given a Hebrew name, like I was when I was born, and a diaspora language name. So we still get two names today, like Shaul did when he was born. So for example, someone given my Hebrew name, David, if I was born in England, might have the name Daryl. It's usually a name that's somewhat close to the name that you were given in Hebrew. In France, if you're born in Paris, you might have the French name Jacques if you're born, and the Hebrew name Yochanan. Or you might have the French name Alan and the Hebrew name Alon. Or if you're born as a Jew in North Africa, you might have the Jewish name Moshe, and you might have the diaspora land language name, which here would be Arabic, of Musa. So you understand what I mean, that Shaul was born into this kind of a culture and a dynamic that still exists today. And that's why he has two names, Paul for these Greek-speaking environs when he's there, and Shaul typically for when he's at home in a Jewish-speaking environment. Here we see his name in Hebrew on the right, and on the left in Greek, Shaul in Hebrew and Paulos in Greek. Shaul means somebody who's desired or asked for. And the name Paulos in Greek means a humble or small person. Okay, let's take a look at the geographic world that Shaul grows up in. He was born in and at least raised as a child in the city of Tarsus, which is in today's nation of Turkey. We can find it on the map here. If you can find the island of Cyprus, everyone on the map it's the only island there in the Mediterranean Sea. If you go just up from Cyprus, in other words, north, you'll see in pink letters where it says, or purple, Cilicia. And right under the red lettering is Tarsus. You can see it there in blue letters, just northwest of the large city of Antioch. So that's where he was from, just north of Cyprus on the Turkish coast in the city of Tarsus. Tarsus had a good-sized Jewish diaspora community. As you know, Tarsus was a Roman colonized city. So there was a decent chance if you lived there that you could have Roman citizenship, which Shaul claimed that his family had. Tarsus was a seaport town with a strong local pagan cult. So when Shaul talks about paganism in his letters, he certainly saw it with his eyes and experienced what that was like when he was growing up in Tarsus. Now Shaul describes his background to us, and here's maybe how we can learn the most about how he grew up and how I'm getting reflection on my glasses here, and how he looked at his growing up years. He's quoted by Luke, who was his physician and traveling chronicler or partner. Luke was a God-fearer. In Greek, that would be a phobomenos to theo, or in Hebrew, we would call it a ger. So he could have been a convert, because a lot of people will ask this question. If Luke is a Gentile physician and Shaul employs him as his private physician, there's a good chance that Shaul was taking medicines that weren't kosher. It's a good chance that Luke would have done things that to Jewish people would not have been according to the customs of the time. So how could Shaul employ a Gentile doctor and expect to be living according to Jewish lifestyle or custom? And well, our answer again is Luke was a God-fearer, the phobomenos to theo that you see above, or a ger, a convert, meaning that Luke lived his life like he was Jewish. And he might have been if he was a convert. This is not my idea. This is from a good number of Christian scholars today, and one Jewish scholar named Dr. David Flusser, who was the history professor at the Hebrew University here in Jerusalem, who wrote a wonderful series of essays on Luke, in which he also agreed that Luke must have been a convert of some sort, either a God-fearer or a ger, a convert. Both categories would have been keeping Jewish halakha, in other words, custom, protocol, and statutes. In Acts 22, here's what Shaul tells us. I am a Jew, and that's in the present tense in the Greek in Acts 22. I am a Jew, born in Tarsus of Cilicia, but brought up in this city, which was Jerusalem. Under Gamliel, I was thoroughly trained in the Torah of our fathers, and was just as zealous for God as any of you are today. The religious leaders all know the way I've lived ever since I was a child, from the beginning of my life in my own country and also in Jerusalem. Now in Acts 22, Shaul is saying these things in Israel. So he's saying, he's giving us kind of a highlight or bottom line of his growing up years. And he tells us quite a bit here, doesn't he? That Gamliel, the famous rabbi, was his teacher, that he was thoroughly trained in the Torah. And we'll come back to that phrase to talk about what that meant. He talks about being, since a child, a very, very devout Jewish person. And then he says something very interesting, that he was brought up in this city, meaning Jerusalem. And we'll talk about what that means later too. Just keep those things in mind. And again, he tells us about his background in Philippians chapter 3, verses 5 through 8. Here's what he says. I had a circumcision on the 8th day, an Israeli by birth, from the tribe of Benjamin, a Hebrew speaker, with Hebrew-speaking parents. In regard to the Torah, a Pharisee. So again, this helps fill things out for us a little bit. We can see that his family was devoutly Jewish. He had his circumcision as prescribed, as instructed in the Torah of Moses on the 8th day. He was an Israeli by birth and from the tribe of Benjamin, spoke Hebrew at home, saying he was a Hebrew speaker in the beginning there with Hebrew-speaking parents. Now, in the ancient world of the diaspora that Shaul grew up in, this was not a given. Not all families knew Hebrew. Only the most devout families certainly would speak Hebrew. So they certainly were very devout as Jews. And he says that in regard to the Torah, a Pharisee, meaning this was the way he was brought up. So it must be that in his family, there was adherence to Pharisaic way of life. And I'm guessing there that some of his family elders may have been Pharisees, meaning that they were trained in Israel like later he was. And remember, he had a nephew when Acts 22 was happening and around the year 60. He had a nephew who was in Israel, probably doing what he did, studying to be schooled in the Torah. So this was in his family, coming to Israel, being educated in the Torah. So again, Shaul is emphasizing he's from a very devoutly Jewish family. And again, they even spoke Hebrew, which was not a given in that part of the world. Here's an irrelevant fact for us, but I find it very interesting and a part of his background. Growing up in Tarsus, Shaul may have had the ability to speak a number of languages. Latin, because Tarsus is a Roman city, and Latin was the language of the Romans. So government things would have been, government documents, anything having to do with the government would have been carried out in Latin. He said he was a Roman citizen, which makes me think that he had exposure to Latin. Certainly he knew Greek. He wrote some of his letters in Greek. He could understand Greek. He certainly was able to speak Greek when he was in Athens and in Corinth. So he was very familiar with that language. And of course, he tells us he knew Hebrew, how to read it and write it. Just by that fact, in dealing with Jewish religious texts from that time, which he did, he would have been able to read also Aramaic, which was the language of the Jewish diaspora in Iran and Iraq of today. So look at all those languages he could deal with, which, by the way, was not a rare thing for the ancient world. But it helps fill us in to understand that Shaul was fluent in all of these languages. So let's summarize Shaul's background then. He's a diaspora Jew in the Roman Empire. There were some over 1 million Jews in that category. He immigrated to Israel to be a student, and we'll touch on that later. He was a student, he tells us, we read that scripture, of Gamliel, the first century head of the Sanhedrin. Sanhedrin was the Jewish assembly that decided on all matters of religious practice and had a court system, at least until the Roman times, when the Romans took away from the Sanhedrin the ability to pass judgment on the most serious crimes that could have been committed. But they still organized as a court. And so he's a student of Gamliel, who is the head of the Sanhedrin, which means he's learning from the most accomplished and famous rabbi in Israel of his time. Shaul lives in Jerusalem during the time that he's in Israel in order to learn from Gamliel. Shaul tells us he's a Pharisee by his affiliation. He tells us he's from a Torah. By Torah, I mean the 5 books of Moses, as well as Jewish custom. He tells us he's from a Torah-loving family. So by logic, Shaul, by coming to Israel and studying, is on the fast track to becoming like his rabbi, a Sanhedrin judge for his vocation. That's the vocational track that Shaul was on. Now, there's really not much written on the subject of Shaul and his Rabbi Gamliel's relationship. Why not? Shaul tells us a lot about Gamliel. He learned at his feet. He was thoroughly trained in all religious matters by Gamliel, he tells us as well. But we really don't have much textual evidence from that time period, meaning there's not a lot written about Shaul's relationship with Gamliel. We just don't have it. Christian scholars don't know what to do with Gamliel. Christian scholars certainly have been reading for 2,000 years what Shaul has told us about him being a student of Gamliel, but they haven't followed up writing what that would have meant because Christian scholarship is not familiar with who Gamliel was and what he taught. Jewish scholars don't like Shaul, at least for the most part. In our modern day and age, that's lightening up a little bit. We do have some more Jewish studies being done on Shaul and what his life would have been like. But for the most part, for the past 2,000 years, Jewish scholars haven't written about Shaul because of the problems that there have been between the church and the Jewish people. It's been kind of a taboo subject. So those 2 points, that Christian scholars don't know what to do with Gamliel and Jewish scholars dislike Gamliel, have made writing about the relationship between Shaul and Gamliel somewhat unpopular throughout history. Now, Messianic Jewish scholarship, that is Jews who believe in Yeshua, can really do a decent job of evaluating Shaul and Gamliel's relationship. We're in a nice position to do that, but there aren't so many Messianic Jewish scholars. So there's also a lack of that happening in our community. However, in Jewish scholarship, we do recognize 3 men named Rabbi Gamliel. There was the patriarch Rabbi Gamliel. This is who Shaul's rabbi was. This Rabbi Gamliel had a grandson also named Gamliel, and that Gamliel also had a grandson named Gamliel. There's a lot of writing in Jewish religious texts about all 3 of them. So sometimes it's difficult to know which one is being talked about when we read about them in Jewish rabbinic literature, which, by the way, the Talmud, which probably all of you have heard about, is our main source for learning about all 3 rabbis Gamliel. But we're interested in Gamliel, the elder, the patriarch, who's also called Gamliel the First. If you look at our slide here, his real name, his given name was Gamliel ben Shimon, Gamliel the son of Simon. He's also called Gamliel the Elder or Gamliel the First. His grandson again was also Gamliel, and he was also a Torah sage and the head of the Sanhedrin like his grandfather. So we have to be careful when we're reading about them to distinguish between the 2 and to make sure that, now I'm going to tell you some things that I think Shaul learned from Gamliel. Before I did that, I had to research rather thoroughly to make sure I'm choosing the right Gamliel's teachings and not his grandsons or his great-great-grandsons, which Shaul would have never known because he died before either of them were alive. So that's a problem we have in scholarship today. Now, Gamliel, the son of Shimon, who is Shaul's teacher, is one of the most honored Sanhedrin heads in the history of the Jewish people. He was a scholar, a teacher, and a judge. He was the lead Pharisee of what's called Bet Hallel. Some of you may have heard of Rabbi Hillel. He's one of the most famous Jewish rabbis in history. Gamliel was his grandson. And Hillel is one of the founders of what we call the Pharisees today. So he founded what's called Bet Hillel, or the house of Hillel. Bet is the word for house in Hebrew, meaning basically the school of Hillel. Gamliel, his grandson, carried on with that in that tradition of his grandfather and his teachings. So Gamliel lived from about the year 33 BC to the year 52 AD or CE. So he was about 85 years old when he died. We don't know exactly when he died. We don't have any record of it, but he was approximately 85. His grandfather Hillel died in about the year 12 or 13, 14, perhaps 15 AD. And it's very possible that in Luke chapter 2, that Yeshua, one of the rabbis who he heard when he went to Jerusalem to go to the southern steps of the temple during the Passover that we read about in Luke 2, where Yeshua went as a 12-year-old, for 3 days, and his parents didn't know where he was, and he was at the feet of the rabbis listening to them, questioning them. It's very possible that Hillel was one of these rabbis. And it's very possible that even Gamliel may have been alive and may have been a child, because he was approximately the same age as Yeshua, maybe a little bit older. So we're told in Jewish rabbinic literature, you can see below a quote from Sota, which is from the Talmud. It's a book of the Talmud. It states this. And what I want us to pick up from this is the great honor that Gamliel has had in Jewish tradition and history. It says, when Gamliel the elder, that's our Gamliel, died, regard for the Torah, meaning the 5 books of Moses, ceased, and purity and piety died. So you can see the great regard with which the rabbis who came after Gamliel, writing about him from a couple of 100 years later, had for him. He's in very high regard. Purity ceased. Piety ceased. Regard for the Torah, meaning love and devotion for the Torah, ceased. So he had the reputation of being great in all 3 of those areas. We have further mention of him in rabbinic writings, and I want to go into some detail in these because we're going to see Shaul repeat some of the same teachings as his teacher Gamliel. So the influence of Gamliel and Shaul is very great. Here's what it states. So let's follow Gamliel. It says, from the time Rabban Gamliel, that's Shaul's teacher, died, sickness came upon the world. We also learned that when Rabban Gamliel died, the glory of the Torah ended. So again, these tracts from a book called Megillah in the Talmud are more or less repeating what we just read from the Talmudic book of Sotah, that the reputation of Gamliel was so great, and he was very beloved. And this is what we should take away from this quote here. Gamliel had a teaching on having 4 different kinds of students. So we're going to read that right now. And that's the next paragraph in our slide. There are 4 kinds of students: the unclean fish, the clean fish, the fish from the Jordan River, and the fish from the Mediterranean Sea. An unclean fish is the poor son who studies scripture, Mishnah, Halachot, and Agadah. I will define all those for us later, but has no understanding. So he's saying this is a person from a poor background, a student from a poor background who who studies the Bible, commentaries on the Bible, but he doesn't understand them. That's one kind of student. Then there's the clean fish. This is the one who has studied and understood everything and is the son of rich parents. The fish from the Jordan is the student of a sage or rabbi who studies scripture, and again, Mishnah, Midrash, Halachot, and Agadah, meaning the writings and commentaries on scripture, but doesn't know how to answer. So he doesn't know how to answer simple questions about what he just studied. The Mediterranean fish, this is the student of a sage or a rabbi who studies scripture, Mishnah, Midrash, Halakha, and Agadah. So in other words, the commentaries on the scriptures, and he knows how to answer. This is from the book there that's quoted. I wonder what kind of student he would have considered Shaul. He doesn't tell us. There's no writing about it. But we understand that Gamliel spent part of his life as the teacher evaluating what kind of student that he had before him. Like all rabbis, he would invest most of his time and his energy into the students who were the best ones, the ones who showed the most promise. Now, Gamliel is also quoted in the book of Acts by Luke. This might be the longest quote of Gamliel that's extra rabbinic writings. We have it here in our New Testament writings. Here's what Luke says. This is from Acts chapter 5, starting, I think, at verse 34. Now, Shimon, or Peter, and his colleagues were taken before the Sanhedrin and more or less quickly judged as to the harm they were doing in Jerusalem, according to the Sanhedrin, by talking about Yeshua. So here's what it says. A Pharisee named Gamliel, a teacher of the Torah who was honored by all the people, and we've just seen that, haven't we, by the quotes that we just read, that he was indeed honored by all the people, and he was probably quite elderly by this time, stood up in the Sanhedrin and ordered that the men, meaning Shimon or Peter and his colleagues, be put outside for a little while. Then he addressed the Sanhedrin. So Gamliel is now going to talk about the case that's before them. Are these men dangerous or not? And what should be done about their talking about Yeshua? Then he addressed the Sanhedrin. Men of Israel, consider carefully what you intend to do to these men. Some time ago, Theudas appeared, claiming to be somebody, and about 400 men rallied to him. He was killed and his followers were dispersed, and it all came to nothing. After him, Judah, the Galilean, appeared in the days of the census and led a band of people in revolt. That would be against the Romans. He too was killed, and all of his followers were scattered. Therefore, in the present case, I advise you, leave these men alone. Let them go. For if their purpose or activity is of human origin, it will fail. So he's saying just like Theudas and this Judah failed in some kind of a movement that wasn't of divine origin, that God was not behind. So he's saying this in verse 39, and here's his bottom line. But if it is from God, so in other words, if all that Yeshua was and stands for is from God, you will not be able to stop these men. You will only find yourselves fighting against God, and his speech persuaded them. So I think if you're a believer in Yeshua reading this, you feel kind of an innate sympathy for Gamliel. This is good advice, and he's open, from what he's saying here, to whether or not belief in Yeshua by the Jewish people is something that may indeed be from God. And we don't hear anything else about Gamliel ever concerning Yeshua. But here's his appearance in the New Testament, and I think it's a rather positive light that Luke casts him in. Here's a man, the head of the Sanhedrin, Gamliel, respected by everybody, and look at his advice. It really is good. And the people in the Sanhedrin followed his advice. So again, one can see by Acts chapter 5 that the Sanhedrin honored the words of Gamliel. Gamliel is given the main role in addressing the situation. And that's usually the last person to speak who has the main role. And usually their words will be the things that are followed. The people who testify or speak before the last person are usually just giving evidence that we should decide this way or that way. But it's the last person whose words are the most honored who will speak. And then the group of judges in the Sanhedrin will decide to do or not to do as that last person has advised them. And we see them taking Gamliel's advice. So this can attest to his position as the main influence in the Sanhedrin at the time. He's called in Jewish literature and rabbinic literature the Nasi of the Sanhedrin. Nasi is a term that means chief or prince. In Israel today, it's used to designate our nation's president. He's called the Nasi. So the ancient Sanhedrin, of which is being talked about here, is made up of 71 people, 71 judges, all schooled thoroughly. About half were Pharisees and half were Sadducees. Gamliel, being the Nasi here, is the chief presiding officer. And again, speaking last shows us that that was true. We're told often in the Talmud that he was the Nasi, so we see him functioning in that role here in Acts chapter 5. There was another important role called the Av Bet Din, which is kind of like the Secretary General of the Sanhedrin. Okay, let's go to the next slide. So Gamliel has a role of prominence and influence. Again, being called Nasi, In the Sanhedrin, this is one of the two most prominent roles, akin to being a president of a high court or a chief high court justice and convening officer. Gamliel, I put in the slide, may have been in this role at this time, but I'm convinced he was, and I think Jewish religious literature tells us he was. And what we see happening in Acts chapter 5 tells us that he was. How does that affect Shaul? Shaul studied then at the feet of the most influential rabbi in Israel at the time he was alive. And that means he got an incredibly good education. So Gamliel was known for 4 major things that are relevant to us. Here they are. He had great compassion on others and on himself. And we see that in Acts 5. He has a compassionate decision concerning Shimon and his colleagues. I mean, some of the other judges in there would have liked to have treated them harsher. However, Gamliel was not like that. Secondly, we define this in Jewish terminology as darchei noam, meaning that Shaul was famous for making rulings on halakha, that means Jewish religious law, that helped people to keep what's written in the Torah and didn't make it harder for them to do so. So in his religious law decisions, which Gamliel spent a lot of time formulating them with his other colleagues in the Sanhedrin, he was always pushing to make interpretations of the Torah, and by the Torah I mean the instructions in the 5 books of Moses, to make them easier to keep instead of harder. So in other words, one of the things that he did in Jewish law at the time, and in Torah law, according to Deuteronomy chapter 19, verse 15, you have to have 2 witnesses to establish, 2 or 3 it says in Deuteronomy 19, to establish anything legally in a Jewish court of law. So if a woman had a husband who was a merchant, and there were plenty of them in the Second Temple times that Shaul and Gamliel lived in, and her husband goes off on a trip and he never comes back, she doesn't know if he's dead or alive. So she can't remarry until there's proof that he's dead and he didn't just run away on her. Now, the problem is if there's no witnesses to testify to what happened to her husband, and 2 or 3 of them, she can never marry again. So some women had husbands, unfortunately, say, who were wine merchants, who would have to go to Italy or Greece or Cyprus to either buy or sell their wines or their produce, and might have been shipwrecked and died. But if there's nobody to come back and tell a Jewish court of law that they were eyewitnesses to what happened, this person was dead, and there's not at least 2 or 3 of these people, this woman is stuck for the rest of her life, not able to marry again, and she probably had no way to support herself. So she was doomed to a life of poverty unless she had sons or daughters who could have helped support her. So that's a real problem for women by the time the Second Temple period rolls around. So what does Gamliel do? He makes a ruling that 1 witness is enough in this situation. The Sanhedrin adopts it, and it becomes Jewish law. Okay, so that's what he was known for, doing things like that, making it easier to keep the Torah as opposed to more difficult. He's also known in point 3 here, and I put it in blue because this is particularly going to be related to Shaul. He's known for writing letters to diaspora Jewish communities, that means communities outside of Israel, regarding how to keep the Torah and explaining new rulings that the Sanhedrin came up with so that the Torah can better be kept. Now, of course, all of you know that one of the main purposes of life for all Jewish communities back then, and they would have all agreed on it, was they wanted to please God by keeping what's written in the Bible. So, of course, writing these kinds of letters from the head of the Sanhedrin to Jewish communities, to other rabbis in those communities to help them and their communities keep the Torah is a very important function. And look what Gamliel does. He writes letters to Jewish communities outside of Israel to help instruct them how to live. Guess who else did that? His student Shaul did that, was quite well known for doing that. Where did Shaul learn to do that? I propose from Gamliel, his rabbi. Fourthly, Gamliel was known for being willing to allow non-Jews to practice parts of Torah. Now, who else was like that? I submit to you, Shaul was. How did Shaul get that way? And I would submit to you, not only from just being convinced from what the scriptures say, but this was also the practice of his Rabbi Gamliel. So, for example, Isaiah 56 verse 7 says, "My house shall be called a house of prayer for all nations." So it's clear that, as well from Exodus chapter 19 verses 5 and 6 and Deuteronomy chapter 4 verses 5 through 8, that the Jewish people are meant to share our knowledge of God with all people. And Gamliel was enthusiastic about that, and certainly Shaul was as well. So in having Shaul be the person chosen by the early Messianic Jewish community in Jerusalem to go out from them and share about the Jewish Messiah and the one God of Israel to non-Jewish communities abroad was a very wise choice because he had been schooled that way. He didn't have any problem with that. Other Jews who came to believe in Yeshua in the first century did have a problem with that. And we read about it in Acts chapter 15. Anyhow, let's look at some examples of Gamliel's ruling in daily practice. And this is again from the Talmud. This is our first story about him here. He bathed on the first night after his wife died. His students questioned him, "Our honored rabbi, you taught us that it is forbidden for a mourner to bathe." He answered them, "I'm not like most people. I'm elderly and frail." Now, in this instance, it's first century Pharisaic halakhic practice. Now, by that phrase, I mean this is the custom of how Pharisees would behave in the first century. That when you're in mourning, you do not take a bath because bathing is considered something that feels good. When you're in mourning, you shouldn't try to make yourself feel good. You should just let the grief out for an entire week. And that's what Jewish people till today do. By tradition, we also don't bathe today. If your father or mother, if a spouse, if a sibling, and God forbid if a child of yours dies, that puts you into mourning. No other relationship does. This is only valid for those relationships. And so Gamliel's wife died. And according to the way the Pharisees lived, he shouldn't have been taking hot or warm baths at night. He does this, and this confused his students. Of course it would. And what's his answer? "I'm elderly and frail. I'm having compassion on myself because I'm an old guy. My muscles and ache. My body needs it to keep going." So he exercised compassion on himself. So we're seeing Gamliel wasn't afraid to break protocol to have compassion on himself. Shaul was like that as well. And he was taught well by his rabbi to make decisions like that. And again, another story about Gamliel. When his household servant Tavi died, he received condolences on his behalf. In other words, he sat what's called Shiva. Shiva means that, again, when one's parents, siblings, spouse, and God forbid sons or daughters should die, one has an open house for a week in the Jewish world. We still do it today. We did it back in Shaul's time. What's that mean? Friends and relatives will come from the community, and it's their job to feed you. It's their job to sit by you for an entire week and comfort you and mourn with you and share stories of the dead person, the deceased beloved person with you. They help you grieve for an entire week. That's the week you're not supposed to bathe. So Shaul's household servant dies. Household servant is not in the category of parents, siblings, spouse, or sons and daughters. And yet, what does he do? He has condolences for them. He mourned the death of his servant and treated him like he would parent, spouse, sibling, or children if they had died. Now, this confuses his students again. His students question him, "Our honored rabbi, you taught us that one doesn't receive condolences for servants." That's correct. Only again for parents, siblings, spouse, and God forbid, sons or daughters. And what's his answer? He answered them, "My servant Tavi wasn't like most servants. He was kosher." That's literally what it says. So what does it mean? First of all, Tavi, his household servant, was not Jewish. And this would really confuse his students because you don't do sitting Shiva, meaning taking the week to mourn for a non-Jew. This is only a Jewish tradition. But what he was doing, and we'll go to our next slide here, Gamliel was honoring his household servant, because from what we know, his household servant had served him many years, even though he wasn't Jewish. And Gamliel loved him as if he was a brother of his. And so he allowed his household servant to do things like put on tefillin. Does everybody know what tefillin are? They're the phylacteries that Jewish men wrap around our arms and put on our head every day. It's talked about in Numbers chapter 15, verse 36 and 7. I'm sorry, Deuteronomy chapter 6, verses 4 through 6 is where you'll find the reference to it. Maybe you've seen Jewish men do that every morning. I do it every morning. And it's a reminder of our covenant relationship with God as we're praying. Anyhow, only Jewish people do that. Yet, Gamliel taught his servant who is not Jewish how to do that. So Gamliel is allowing this Gentile servant of his to come into his world and share his riches, which of course all has to do with his relationship with God. And as well, he receives the visitors for the Shiva week for his servant, who he's not obligated to do that for. So a summary of Gamliel. He issued halakhic rulings of compassion. He wasn't afraid to buck the tide and go against tradition. He wrote letters to communicate with Jewish communities on the borders of Israel and in the diaspora. He included non-Jews in Hashem, meaning God's kingdom. In these four matters, it's logical to assume, because we see evidence of it, that Shaul was very much influenced by Gamliel. I can't reach any other conclusion than that one. Why? Number one, Shaul communicated by written letters with his students, just like Gamliel did. Other Jewish rabbis at the time of Shaul didn't do this so much. Secondly, Shaul was compassionate and flexible in his application of the Torah, like Gamliel was. Thirdly, Shaul included non-Jews in his view of the kingdom of God. And in fact, he dedicates most of his life to trying to bring non-Jews into the kingdom of God through the Jewish Messiah, Yeshua. And Gamliel was similar, including non-Jews in his view of the kingdom of God. Fourthly, Shaul definitely had no hesitation about bucking the tide of opinion in his life, did he? He was always being criticized for doing things against the way things should have been done. And Gamliel was the same way. And then points number 1 and 3, that Shaul communicated by written letters with his students. And number 3, that he included non-Jews in his view of the kingdom of God. Shaul exceeded what Gamliel had done. In other words, Shaul really emphasizes these things in his life, whereas Gamliel did, but it wasn't perhaps the main thrust of what he did with his life. Now, let's take a look at the education of Shaul. What would he have learned? In Lake Second Temple Yeshiva, meaning Jewish Religious College in Jerusalem, this would have been what Shaul studied in, a late Second Temple Yeshiva, or in other words, again, a religious college. Now, this would have been a training school that Shaul studied in for Pharisees. And you can see this is a modern day yeshiva before us on our slide, but Shaul studied in somewhat of a similar environment. What was he training for? First off, for ordination as a rabbi. Rabbi simply means a teacher of the Torah, teacher of the scriptures. Number 2, he's training for membership in the Pharisees' party to reach a certain level where he would have been accepted as a Pharisee. Thirdly, he's training for appointment as a judge in the great Sanhedrin. This is kind of his vocational goal. This is the greatest honor a Jewish young man could try to attain in his life. And for his family, it would have made them absolutely so proud of him to be appointed as one of the 71 high court judges in Jewish life. Fourthly, we know the Pharisees operated 7 religious colleges or yeshivas in Jerusalem at the time Shaul lived. So we studied at one of them. We know that 5 of the yeshivas or colleges were staffed by Bet Shammai. That was the most populous group of Pharisees coming from the tradition of a rabbi named Shammai. 2 were staffed by Bet Hillel. And Bet Hillel, again, are all of Gamliel's students, because Hillel is Gamliel's grandfather. And no doubt Shaul studied in one of those two yeshivas who were affiliated with his teacher's grandfather. By the way, there was quite a difference between the schools of Shammai and Hillel in terms of some of the things that Gamliel was known for. Now, Shaul is educated as a Pharisee from Bet Hillel's school, that is the Torah schools of Hillel. Just talking a little bit about Hillel will help us fill in to see the kind of atmosphere that Shaul would have studied in. Again, Gamliel is Shaul's teacher, and he's the grandson of this Hillel. So Hillel, his name was Shimon ben Hillel. And what characterized Hillel's interpretation of the Torah that Shaul is learning through Gamliel? First of all, mercy, because they were more liberal in their interpretation of how to keep the Torah than strict. In other words, we talked about Darchei Noam. That means to try to help people keep the Torah by the way that you teach them that they need to do that. You're trying to help them do this, not trying to make it more difficult. And this is what the school of Hillel that Shaul learns in is famous for. So Gamliel was known to be like his grandfather Hillel, and I believe Shaul was like Gamliel as well in his halakhic teaching and practice. It makes sense, right? Like teacher, like student, like grandfather, like father, and like grandson. All of them are going to be similar in the way that they're interpreting and keeping the Torah. On to our next slide. Here's a story from the Talmud that introduces us to Hillel. I'll only tell this one, but it's really a great illustration of how Hillel taught. Here's the story. It's from the Talmud. It happened that a certain pagan came to Shammai. Shammai is Hillel's partner, but he has his own Torah school. That's much stricter in its interpretation of the Torah than Hillel's was. So it happened that a certain pagan came to Shammai and said to him, "Make me a proselyte, make me a Jew, make me somebody who follows the one God, on condition that you teach me the entire Torah, meaning the 5 books of Moses, while I stand on 1 foot." So Shammai drove him away with the builder's measuring rod, which was in his hand. Shammai, by profession, was also a builder of buildings. So he takes the measuring stick and he drives this guy out of his office because he's asking him to do something he can't do. Convert me in just a couple of seconds of time, and as much time as it takes for you to stand on a foot. Well, most people can only stand on one of their feet for a couple of seconds. Okay, so he's asking Shammai to do something that Shammai wasn't willing to or couldn't do. Now, the same pagan, when he came to Hillel, Hillel said to him, "Okay, I'll do it. What's hateful to you, don't do to your neighbor." That's the entire Torah, while the rest is its commentary. Now go and learn it. And you can see that Hillel's attitude is quite different. This young man wanted to become a believer in the one God of Israel. I'm going to help him. I'm going to play his game by doing this. He does it with a great teaching that, by the way, our Messiah Yeshua also repeated, but the reverse in terms of its grammar doesn't matter. So this is what Hillel is known for. Now let's look at Shaul's student life. What would it have been like? And here's the Jewish pattern of education for his era, also found in the Talmud. Rabbi Yehuda, who lived during the years posted there, 130 to 220. So Rabbi Yehuda is in his prime, some 90 or 100 years after Shaul dies, but the educational system remained the same in spite of the problems with the war against the Romans that we had. It states this: a 5-year-old goes to study the written Torah. That means the Bible. A 10-year-old goes to study the Mishnah. That's rabbinic commentary on the Bible. A 13-year-old is ready to study the Gemara. It should be there. I made a mistake. And a 15-year-old also goes to study the Gemara. And Gemara is the commentary on the commentary of the Bible. An 18-year-old gets married. A 20-year-old begins his career. A 30-year-old is strong. A 40-year-old has understanding. A 50-year-old counsels. A 60-year-old is an elder. A 70-year-old has white hair, that's me, and is thus deserving of respect. Oh, good. An 80-year-old is supernaturally strong. A 90-year-old is stooped over, and should you hit 100 years old, you're nearly dead and passed on into the next world. Okay, but what this teaching does from the Talmud, it shows us the educational course that a Jewish boy would take if his parents continued to have him involved in just beyond the basic education. Every Jewish boy at the time could read and write in Hebrew and could read the Bible. But with some, that's all the education they got, plus whatever trade they learned. But the pattern of education for young boys like Shaul, whose parents then send them off to go to a Jewish religious college, is this. At 5 years old, they already start studying Bible. At 10 and at 13 and at 15, they're expected to master certain levels of rabbinic commentaries on the Bible. And then at 18, they go to get married, which also is fulfilling one of the commandments in the Bible. And so that's approximately what Shaul would have been doing with his life. Shaul never did get married as far as we know, but the other things up from ages 5 to 15, he certainly seems to have done. And it could be very logical that according to this pattern that Rabbi Yehuda talked about here, that Shaul would have left Tarsus for Jerusalem between the ages of 13 and 17. My guess would be toward the earlier age, because as you saw, according to the teaching of Rabbi Judah we just read, that age 13, you're expected to begin to study and become responsible for learning more about the rabbinic commentaries. Also at age 15, it could be at age 15 he went. 17 was kind of the maximum for going on that student track. So Shaul's goal when his family sent him from Tarsus to Jerusalem is to study Pharisaic halakha, meaning development of biblical law. To become an expert at this and to climb the ladder into the Sanhedrin. You know, this could possibly take 2 decades of study to succeed at doing. So if Shaul comes at age 13, it's very possible that he wouldn't have been a Sanhedrin judge if he succeeds at studying like this until he's in his late 30s. So easily could have taken 2 decades. Now, doing this would have been considered the highest form of Jewish education in that era. Remember, Shaul is told by the Roman governor in Acts chapter, I think it's 26, Shaul, you've learned so much, it's driving you mad. I'm laughing at that now, but it's serious because he did have a great education. His family he would have brought great honor and much cavelling, I put here, to his family in Tarsus, being a student like this. And cavelling is a Yiddish term, actually, and it means just great pride and joy to his family to be succeeding at this track. Because this is the ideal for a Jewish scholar to be, doing what Shaul was doing and succeeding every step in the way. So he joined one of the Pharisees' yeshivas, meaning religious colleges, operated by the house of Hillel, under Gamliel's directorship, and you just can't get a better education than that. So what did Shaul study? What subjects? We know. Hey, we know. Okay, I'm trying to move my slide here so I can read it. I'm not succeeding. 1 second here. Here we go. States this. This is from the Talmud again. Rabbi Yochanan, who was a contemporary of Shaul, he lived at the same time, said this, and he's also from the house of Hillel, meaning he went through the same education that Shaul did. So here's what Shaul studied. The written Torah, meaning the books of Genesis through Malachi, the Mishnah, meaning rabbinic commentary, at least parts of it that were in existence before the year 200 AD, the Gemara, which again is part of the contents of that time period of rabbinic teaching. So he'd have been thoroughly schooled on the biblical books and how to look at and interpret them. Also, it says he was schooled in halakha, agadah, small details of the Torah, small details of the scribes, inferences, analogies, the calendar, gematria, the talk of angels, which means apocalyptic writings, the talk of spiritual beings, the talk of palm trees, which means botany and biology, stories about fullers and foxes, meaning parables, and other important and not so important matters. All of this was the focus of his education. Let's talk about what that would have meant. So Shaul is thoroughly trained, he said, at the feet of Gamliel in these things: the Bible, the Mishnah, which again is rabbis' teachings on biblical matters up to Shaul's time period. Here's an example of what you would find in the Mishnah. Shaul grew up with somebody named Shimon, who happened to be Gamliel's son. Shaul and he are the same age. I have to think they studied in the same yeshiva or religious college, or that at least they knew each other, because they both would have been studying at the feet of Rabbi Gamliel. Here's an example. Here's what Rabbi Shimon, Shaul's contemporary, taught. It's not the study of something that's most important, it's the doing of it. So that's one of his main teachings, Rabbi Shimon. And it just shows us what the Mishnah is made out of, what it is. It's teachings from the rabbis that connect back to the scripture. Also mentioned in this list of what Shaul would have studied is halakha. That means rulings and protocols about how to live one's life according to the Bible. In other words, I know what's written in the book of Numbers and in the book of Exodus. How do I live it today? How do I live these instructions out? This is what halakha is. So Shaul is going to be thoroughly schooled in the history of halakhic practice for the Jewish people. Agadah is mentioned. What's Agadah? These are stories and legends about the rabbis' lives that give us insight into the Bible's principles. He would have been thoroughly educated in that. Today we have a big series of Aggadic stories about the rabbis' lives that help us with this. It's called the Ein Yaakov. It's very fun to read. Shaul also, according to what is written here, would have been schooled in inferences and analogies, it says. This means the hermeneutical principles of how to interpret the Bible. He's schooled in how to interpret the Bible that was taught by the Pharisees. And I'm going to teach you right now in just 5 minutes 2 of these 7 principles. So you're going to learn like Shaul did. Ready? Here we go. One was called Kol V'chomer. It means an a fortiori argumentation if you're good in Latin, or from the lesser to the greater. We have an example of this. Our Messiah Yeshua used this same teaching method in how he taught. Here it is, Matthew chapter 16, verses 2 and 3. Here is he teaching. He said this, when it's evening, you say, it will be fair weather, for the sky is red. And in the morning, it will be stormy today because the sky is red and threatening. You know how to interpret the appearance of the sky, but you cannot interpret the signs of the times. In other words, this is interpreting the Bible by saying this. If point A is true, point B is all the more true. So as Yeshua says here, if you can do A, if you can look at the sky and you know what the weather's going to be like, all the more you should be able to do point B, which is to interpret signs of the times that you're in. That's one of the biblical interpretational methods of Hillel, of Gamliel, and of Shaul, and of Yeshua. Another one was called Gezerah Shavah, and that are the inferences and analogies that are mentioned in the list of what Shaul would have learned. And here's what it means. If you have similar wording appearing in 2 separate verses, the meaning of the one can be applied to the meaning of the other. Here's an example. It's the word b'mo'ado in Hebrew. It means in its appointed time. It's used to talk about the Passover lamb in Numbers chapter 9, and for the daily burnt offering in Numbers chapter 28. And that daily burnt offering was offered on the Sabbath. So it can be inferred, or it can be concluded, that the term b'mo'ado will always include something being done on the Sabbath. So we learn from this that the Passover lamb of Numbers chapter 9, which uses the same language, that same phrase b'mo'ado to describe it, and which is used in Numbers 28, we can draw the conclusion that the Passover lamb can be offered even on the Sabbath, if it has to be. Because in Numbers 28, what needed to be offered on the Sabbath was, and in Numbers 9, we should conclude it could be as well. So in other words, you're taking from one verse to help give you meaning for another one. That's another interpretational method. So these are the kinds of things Shaul learned about. He was also learned in some other things. The Jewish calendar, it says, meaning Leviticus 23's times, like the new month he would learn about, spotting the new moon he had to do by his eye. That's how they did it in Second Temple days. We do it by calculation today, but by then they did it by actually seeing it. So he had to learn how to do that. He had to learn when the holidays occur and how to calculate that. He had to know about the organization of the parashah readings of his era, meaning the weekly biblical readings. This can be complicated and takes teamwork between students and rabbis to do. Shaul was thoroughly schooled in how to do that. He was also schooled, we're told, in gematria. That was one of the things listed in what the educational curriculum was for Pharisees. This means the repetition of numbers in the Bible. All of us know that the number 7 is special, correct? Shaul was learned about that. He could have told us why and given us examples. The number 3 also has a special meaning in the Bible. So does the number 4. So does the number 12. So does the number 40. Shaul was learned at taking the numbers and being able to divulge or break open their meaning for us as used in the scripture. The talk of angels it mentions, which means the apocalyptic writings, because angels are quoted talking to people in the apocalyptic writings. So in other words, Shaul would have read books like 1st through 4th Esdras, the book of Janus and Jambres, which is also extra biblical works. In fact, in 2 Timothy chapter 3, verse 8, Shaul shows he had knowledge of the book of Janus and Jambres. Today we only possess fragments of it, but he obviously read it, because he says to Timothy, just as Janus and Jambres stood up to oppose Moshe, so, and then he talks more about that. So he had familiarity with these things. Shouldn't surprise us, because the Pharisees did. Okay, so on the right here in my slide, I have a great book for understanding today's calendar. If you're interested in it, this is Nathan Bushwick who wrote it. It's called Understanding the Jewish Calendar. It's the best book I've ever read on it. And that's just in case you're interested. But Shaul would have been an expert at that, as all the Pharisees would have been. And that's not all. Ready? The list continued that we read. He studied the talk of palm trees. That means botany and biology. Stories about fullers and foxes, meaning parables. They're called mishalim in Hebrew. We always learn the term parables. In Hebrew, that category did exist, again called mishalim. So he had studied natural sciences, and he'd studied Jewish Torah-based storytelling. Again, quoting Governor Festus, the Roman governor, to Shaul in Acts chapter 26, verse 24, he heard Shaul talk for just a couple of minutes, talking about Yeshua. What does he say? Shaul, your great learning has driven you insane. And not to worry, that was not the truth. Shaul even tells him, my noble Festus, I'm not insane at all. What I'm saying is reasonable and true. Those were his next words. Okay, and one more learned a necessary skill that Shaul had. We oftentimes don't think about this, but he also would have learned it being a student of the Pharisees. Okay, we know he could make and repair tents. This could have been his family's profession. But here's what I mean. In Acts chapter 16, Shaul is a mohel. I'll explain what that is in a minute. Well, I'll explain it now. Mohel is someone who knows how to carry out the rite of milah or circumcision. Shaul was a circumciser. He learned probably in Israel under Gamliel how to perform the rite of circumcision. And this was, in the Jewish world, a very important role back then. And it still is in Jewish communities. We still learn that today. And in fact, a ritual circumciser today is better educated than a medical doctor in carrying out this practice, because that's all they do for 2 to 3 to 4 years after they graduate religious college, is learn how to perform this rite correctly. This is considered, by teaching from the Torah, a circumcision ritual, the entrance rite into Jewish life for all males. So it's very, very important. Shaul knew how to do this. How do we know that? In Acts 16, he circumcises Timothy. So in sum, Shaul had the top quality education that a young man could have who had aspirations to be a leading rabbi, a Torah teacher, and a judge. All I can do is tip my hat to them, because I've tried studying most of those areas, and it's not an easy thing to do. Now, what does Shaul write after he becomes a believer in Yeshua? And I think this is very important, because we misunderstand Shaul a lot as he's talking about these things. Shaul is going to talk about what he did with his life. He says this, and this is from Philippians 3, 7, and 8. The things that used to be advantages for me, I have, because of the Messiah, come to consider a disadvantage. Not only that, but I consider everything a disadvantage in comparison with the supreme value of knowing Messiah Yeshua is my sovereign. It was because of him that I gave up everything and regarded all as garbage in order to gain the Messiah. It's Philippians 3, 7, and 8. Now, when I was a young Jewish believer in Yeshua, here's what people taught me about these two scriptures. They're telling me that Shaul threw away everything having to do with his Jewish world, everything having to do with his educational background, everything having to do with being a Pharisee as garbage. He considered it garbage. But I want to ask this question, and I don't think that interpretation is true at all of these verses. What are the Zemion and Skubalon, meaning the vanity and the garbage that he writes about in these two verses? Is it his Jewish background? Is it Jewish practice? Is it being a Pharisee? What is it? Is it things like circumcision? What is it that he threw away? What were the disadvantages and the garbage? Certainly not being Jewish, because Shaul later, and this is well after he becomes a believer, he writes the book of Romans. And I'm going to read from Romans chapter 3, starting at the first verse. Shaul asked this question. Now again, remember, he's a believer already. So if Philippians 3 meant everything having to do with the Jewish world, then he contradicts himself here rather strongly. He asked this question: what then advantage has the Jewish person? What's the value of being circumcised? In other words, of being Jewish? Much in every way, he answers. In the first place, Jews were entrusted with the very words of God. If some of them were unfaithful, so what? Does their unfaithfulness cancel God's faithfulness? Heaven forbid, he answers. Okay, so it wasn't being Jewish he was throwing away as garbage. What about his education? It wasn't his education. What about his membership with the Pharisees? Could it be that? Let's take a look at Acts chapter 23. Now, I'm not proving right now it wasn't his education, because we talked about the things he learned from Gamliel, the 4 major things that he practiced till he died. So I won't go back there, but you heard about it. Acts chapter 23, verses 6 and 7. Here's what he states. Okay, Shaul is being grabbed now by some religious authorities and made to answer for what he has been teaching. But knowing that one part of the Sanhedrin, so it could have been the Sanhedrin of 71 here, consisted of Sadducees and the other of Pharisees, Shaul shouted this: brothers, I myself am a Pharisee and the son of Pharisees, and it's concerning the hope of the resurrection of the dead that I'm being tried. When he said this, an argument arose between the Pharisees and Sadducees, and the crowd was divided. So the judges are divided about what to do with him. Okay, now, what happens here? First of all, Acts chapter 23 happens around the year 60. So Shaul's been a believer a long time, and this is toward the end of his life. And he says here, toward the end of his life, in Greek, it's very clear in the present tense, I am a Pharisee. He could have said in Greek, I used to be a Pharisee, but he doesn't. He says, I am a Pharisee. Now, he was, remember, okay, we'll talk about this verse a little later too, because some people would have said, well, if what you're saying is true, what about the idea that maybe he's trying to get the Pharisees and Sadducees to argue with each other so they'll let him go? If you believe that, then you believe that Shaul is insincere and that he's trying to manipulate the crowd so he could be free. Shaul was never, ever afraid of being imprisoned. He was imprisoned many times. The prophet Agabus told him he was going to go to Jerusalem, and what was going to happen to him? He was going to be put in prison and brought back to Rome. He knew this was going to happen. So he's not trying to get free, right? He's trying to give a valid testimony of who he is and what he believes. Okay, so let's rethink this. What were the disadvantages and the garbage he's talking about in Philippians 3? Let's remember that Shaul's on the vocational track to be a scholar and Sanhedrin judge. This was his profession. He was going to be a Sanhedrin judge. This is what he gave up. I gave up everything and regarded all as garbage. That is compared to being a bringer of the good news to the world. Being a scholar and a judge pales in comparison to him of having the vocation of bringing the good news of Yeshua to the world. Like garbage compares to useful items. God forbid he should be calling being Jewish garbage. And again, in Romans 3, he would disagree with his own opinion here if he was doing that from Philippians. So I hope you understand what I'm trying to say here, what he's considering garbage. It's his vocational track that he had been on. I'm going to paraphrase Philippians 3, 7, and 8 now. Due to its greater value to me, I abandoned my vocational aspirations because they pale in comparison with my new call. I've taken up another call as a prophetic messenger to the nations to draw them to Messiah and to the one true God. Shaul is looking at this as the highest calling he could ever have. So that being a Sanhedrin judge, it pales in comparison. He'll put it aside, like people put aside garbage, as something that's not useful. So trying to be a Sanhedrin judge is not useful to him anymore. Doing this is. And therefore, that I believe, all my mind, is what he's thinking about. And now, believe it or not, I'm going to paraphrase my paraphrase. Really? Yep. Here it goes. I am of more use to God now with the prophetic calling to bring the Gentile peoples around Israel to God and to Messiah than I would be if I was steaming ahead on my vocational path to be a judge and Sanhedrin member. I've left that vocational pursuit with no regrets because I'm helping our people fulfill our national calling more with what I'm doing now. That, I believe, is what Shaul is trying to tell us in his own kind of language in Philippians chapter 3. And just as kind of the bottom line of what am I talking about here when I say the national calling of the Jewish people? We find that in Exodus chapter 19, verses 5 and 6, and Deuteronomy chapter 4, verses 5 to 8. That the Jewish people are meant to be a priestly nation and a priest to the world and a holy nation in Exodus 19. Well, this is what Shaul is thinking about. Being a priestly nation to the world. What better way to do it than show Messiah with the Gentile nations who'll bring the world to the one God of Israel? And Deuteronomy 4, 5 through 8, that talks about Gentile people will see when Israel is living like we should be and loving God like we should be, that there's wisdom in God and that there's no God as wise as our God and no God is as close to his people as God is. These are the kinds of things that Shaul looked at as his job and as the job of the entire nation. And so now he's fulfilling it better in what he's doing than he ever would have been following his old vocational track. Now, after he becomes a believer, Shaul continues to mention Gamliel with no sign of disrespect ever. If he had cast off all of Gamliel's influence on him as garbage, he wouldn't be speaking about Gamliel like this, would he? Acts 22, verse 3. Acts 22, again, taking place in the last couple of years of Shaul's life. And he says, he was brought up in the city and trained at the feet of Gamliel. Shaul looked at his upbringing in Jerusalem from his early teen years onward as the most formative part of his life. He was brought up, meaning he was raised and he was brought to maturity in Jerusalem. And who was the largest part of this being brought up and raised? It was Gamliel, the only name mentioned at all in his short biography that he gives here. So this is great respect. Gamliel helped bring him up. Gamliel trained him. And he doesn't act ashamed of his background. He's using it to try to tell us how he's qualified to talk about God and talk about Messiah Yeshua. This is his background. He uses the Greek word anathramonos, which in Acts 22, which means to be brought up. And again, this shows us Shaul's idea that he was greatly influenced by Gamliel. He's not throwing that away. Anathramonos means to rear or to bring up, to educate, to nourish, to promote growth. And you see it there in Greek before you. Shaul was a native of the city of Tarsus. So here's a question to ask. Didn't his parents bring him up in Tarsus? He doesn't mention it here. Of course they brought him up there. And yet he states he was brought up in Jerusalem. So what's he saying? Is he saying that his life with Gamliel, he took the father role and his real father stopped bringing him up? Not really. What he's saying is that the formative years of his life that helped him with everything that he knows about God started when he learned from Gamliel. And he refers to Gamliel very respectfully. One would like to know what Gamliel thought of his student Shaul after his belief in Yeshua. We'll never know, at least not till the other side here. So here's my conclusion. Shaul considered his learning under Gamliel as primary to his identity and his personal history. It was this time period that defined what it meant to Shaul to be brought up. I mean, he says it, not me. So Shaul did not throw away the valuable lessons in the memory of his background. In fact, I have in my slide here somebody holding gold. He considered it rather like he would gold. How did Shaul view himself as a Pharisee now? Did he stop being a Pharisee when he believed in Messiah? We're most often told yes. In fact, I've never read more than just maybe 5 or 6 scholars will say no to this. But did he leave? In Acts 23, verse 6, as Shaul's defending his life and his life's work, he speaks. We quoted this verse already. I want to go over it again. I myself am a Pharisee. And he talks about Pharisaic belief in the resurrection of the dead. Now, certainly as a believer in Yeshua, this would have made him believe in the resurrection of the dead, but also his background in the Pharisees would affirm that. And that's what he brings up when he's with these people. It's a common belief between believers in Yeshua then and the Pharisees in believing the resurrection of the dead, and he appeals to that belief here. Okay, this verse is written in the present tense in Greek. It says in Greek, ego phariseus emi, which means I am presently a Pharisee. If we can take Shaul's words literally, and I'm going to argue that we should always take his words in a literal, historical, grammatical meaning, simple words, he's telling us he never did leave the Pharisees by inference. Now, maybe the Pharisees may have decided to give him the cold shoulder. In fact, it sure seems like it. But I don't think that originated from him. Now, let's look at an interesting example here. How am I doing on time? Wonderful, good. In Acts chapter 13, Shaul's first travel abroad as a representative of the Jerusalem Messianic Jewish community to share the good news. We go to we start in chapter 13, verses 15 and 16. And this is going to describe a very interesting incident here. We read it, and it states, and Shaul is coming now into a synagogue in Antioch, and they're going to ask him to do something here. It says, after the reading from the Torah in synagogue on the Sabbath day this was, and from the prophets, the synagogue leaders sent them a message, meaning sent Shaul and Barnabas and others who were with them. Brothers, if any of you has a word of, is Barnabas still with him here? I think he is. Anyhow, whoever it was who was traveling with him. If any of you has a word of exhortation for the people, speak. So Shaul stood, motioned with his hand, and he gave a long talk. Why did they ask Shaul to speak? He's a stranger in this synagogue. He's never been there before. He comes into it, and you just ask him to speak? Does anyone normally ask a stranger to come and speak to their congregations in the Jewish or Christian world? You ask a stranger to come up and talk to you about the scripture? Who knows what you're going to hear? However, I can think of only one possibility of why they would look at Shaul and say, you must speak to us. The Pharisees wore a uniform that distinguished them from other Jews. If he would have continued to wear the Pharisees' distinguishing uniform, we think it was either a sash or maybe a belt that went across the middle of a certain color, then he would have been recognized as such by Jews worldwide and by this Jewish community in Antioch. Oh, look, there's a Pharisee from Jerusalem here. He's so well educated in the Torah. He's the best of our Torah commentators. Let's get him to comment. In fact, the congregation would have been honored to have a visiting Pharisee, one of the leading Torah teachers worldwide of the Jewish people, speak and teach them. And in verse 42, look at the response to the visiting Pharisee who believes in Yeshua. Look at what they say about him here. Let's look at verse 42 of chapter 13. As they left, the people invited Shaul and Barnabas to tell them more about the matters the following Shabbat. They liked what this Pharisee had to say. They believed what this honored teacher said. And so this is an incident that I've never heard explained outside of the possibility I'm bringing up here. Now, this is just a possibility. I can't say it's 100% sure, but it's the one that makes sense to me. If he would have been wearing the Pharisaic sash or belt for the rest of his life, that's a sure sign that he never considered himself to have left the Pharisees. Cold shoulders he might have received from some of his former colleagues aside. Now, let's take a look at where this occurred in Pisidian Antioch. It's right in the heart of modern-day Turkey. So it says in Acts 13, they went to Pisidian Antioch, and on the Sabbath, they went to synagogue and sat down. So we can see Pisidian Antioch in the blue lettering there. Now, we know that Shaul was from Tarsus. We can see Tarsus on our map toward the right side on the coastal area there of southern Turkey. Pisidian Antioch is quite a distance from Tarsus, so nobody would have known him because he grew up in Turkey. Tarsus is too far away from Pisidian Antioch to have been known, and too much time would have gone by as well. So he wasn't recognized because of his growing up in Tarsus. Now, there were some Pharisees who grew up with Shaul and were educated with him in Jerusalem. And one of them's name was, I quoted from him before, Shimon ben Gamliel, the one who said the major thing is not learning the Torah, but doing it. He was Shaul's classmate and contemporary. And he may have testified, or at least his colleagues did, on Shaul's behalf in Acts chapter 23. I want to go over this just for a second, verses 6, 7, 8, and 9 of chapter 23 of the book of Acts. Again, happening in the last 2.5 years of Shaul's life. It says, some of the Torah teachers who were on the side of the Pharisees stood up and joined in. This is at the hearing that Shaul had to justify him teaching about Yeshua. We don't find anything wrong with this man, meaning Shaul, and if a spirit or an angel spoke to him, what of it? So what? Okay, now if Shaul did not respect the Pharisees or had left them in anger or in some kind of show that they were a bunch of garbage, do you think that Pharisees from a few years later would have stood up for him? Not if he would have insulted them like that. But he never did. In fact, would they have testified on his behalf if he would have been insulting them and putting them down and divorcing himself from them? They come to his side. They understand, okay, we might not agree with what he says about Yeshua, but everything else he says, he's one of us. Okay, by the way, our caricature here, our little depiction on the right, our drawing is of Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel, who was Shaul's contemporary. He was rumored to have been able to juggle 7 or 8 torches at the same time, and he would entertain crowds doing that during the holiday of Sukkot. That's beside our point here, though. Okay, now here's the allegation that sometimes you'll hear that I think is absolutely false, and that's that Shaul was just working the crowd. I put crying, I meant trying to get Pharisees and Sadducees into a fight with each other and let them go. And there we have a kind of a cartoon about what happened to Shaul here. It says, then Shaul, knowing that some of them were Sadducees and the others Pharisees, called out in the Sanhedrin, my brothers, I'm a Pharisee, descended from Pharisees. I stand on trial because of the hope of the resurrection of the dead. And again, my comment is the same one I made before. If we think Shaul was just playing and manipulating the crowd to set himself free or get them to rule on his behalf, you need to be careful because we're insinuating that he was insincere and manipulative. In the Shaul that I read, his letters that I read, the history Luke gives of him, present him in a totally other fashion than being manipulative and worried about spending time in jail. Acts chapter 28, verse 17 is a telltale verse for me. Excuse me, I'm just checking the time. We're doing really well. Okay, Acts 28:17 is going to tell us how Shaul regarded his observance of the Torah, his Pharisaic identity, and his Jewish identity. And the reason I'm kind of ending on this verse with this section of what I want to talk about is because it happens in the last 2 years, maybe even in the last year of his life, when Shaul is in captivity, house arrest in Rome. And there we have a depiction of what that would have been like. He's sitting down and writing with a Roman soldier looking over his shoulder. We're told by Luke that Shaul was able to rent a house in Rome. and to have any visitors he wanted. He was guarded by a Roman detail, however, because he was still under Caesar, who unfortunately happened to be Nero, who later on ended up murdering Shaul in one of his crazy rampages against Jews and or Christians. Okay, so Shaul says in Acts 28:17, in the last 2 years of his life, again, while under house arrest in Rome, what we read in verse 17. Let's read verse 17. It says, 3 days later, he called together the local Roman Jewish leaders. When he had assembled, Shaul said to them, my brothers, although I have done nothing against our people or against the customs of our ancestors, I was arrested in Jerusalem and handed over to the Romans. That's verse 17. Let's unpack this verse a little. What does Shaul say here? Number one, he's never done anything against the Jewish people. Number two, he's never done anything to transgress the customs of our fathers, he says. I want to go into that phrase a little bit. What were the customs of our fathers? The Greek there is ethesi tois patruos. You can see it there. The word ethesi in Greek comes from the Greek word ethos, which we have in English. And it literally is translated into Hebrew, or can be, as the traditions or ethics of our fathers. And in fact, it might be a bit ironic that we even have a book in the Talmud called The Ethics of Our Fathers, which would be the Hebrew translation very much of the phrase Shaul is using here. But I consulted 3 friends of mine. Here are 2 of them, Mark Kinzer on the bottom and John Fisher at the top, 2 leading Messianic Jewish scholars today. And I weighed in with both of them and asked each of them, could Shaul be referring to Pharisaic tradition and customs when he says he's never transgressed the traditions and ethics of our fathers? Kinzer said to me, I believe the phrase traditions and ethics of our fathers refers to general Jewish practice and tradition, which is how the Greek ethesi, coming from the word ethos, most often is understood. So Kinzer wouldn't agree with, fully at least, with how I'm going to develop this. Fisher is a bit more open to it. He's on the top. And I'll summarize what he said, because he answered me at length, which was very nice of him to do. And he said, I take this as a general Jewish tradition, but in context, I'm open to this, including Pharisaic practice. So he's open to it. Now steps in, I didn't stop there, now steps in Joe Shulam, veteran Israeli congregational leader and scholar. And he gave me his opinion. He said, Shaul means the oral Torah, meaning Pharisaic tradition here. Not the Torah given from God through Moses, but given from our fathers. And I tend to agree with him. So you can see that even Messianic Jewish scholarship doesn't agree on what this phrase means. But I'm saying if we look at the way Shaul behaved all throughout the book of Acts, and we, even throughout his letters, from what we can gather from what he writes, and we compare it to Acts 28:17, I think it's consistent with what he's saying in 28:17, so that whatever he meant, his lifestyle as a Pharisee can be included in this phrase. Okay, and again, I can't prove it to you with a text because there's not enough written about it. However, here are my thoughts. Though most Jewish scholars, or most scholars, period, assess that ethesi or ethics refers to general Jewish life and traditions, I do not see why it could not include Pharisaic practice, particularly given the speaker Shaul. And just because I gave you a nice photo of all those other gentlemen, I'm giving you one of me here, doing my favorite thing, which is drinking coffee and making somebody else pay for it. So that's what I'm doing on the right here. Okay, so Shaul tells us that he never stopped keeping the strictest standards in his keeping of Torah. And if that's not what Acts 28:17 means, which I think it is, but if it's not, then if we just take a look at how he lived, I think we have proof of that. So let's look at some examples with the few minutes we have left of his Torah keeping from Luke's writings. Okay, Acts chapter 21, we're going to start. I have to get a drink first, excuse me. In Acts 21, verses 20 to 24, Shaul has just returned to Jerusalem from a trip abroad, and he's talking with Yaakov, who's Yeshua's half-brother and the chief rabbi of the early Messianic Jewish community in Jerusalem. Okay, So Yaakov and his elders said this to Shaul. You see, brother, how many thousands of Jews have believed, and all of them are zealous for the Torah. And now he's apparently must have been in sight of the temple esplanade where he's showing this to Shaul as Shaul is with him. Verse 21, they've been informed that you teach all the Jews who live among the Gentiles to turn away from Moshe, meaning the Torah of Moses, the 5 books of Moses, telling them not to circumcise their children or live according to our customs. What shall we do? They certainly will hear that you've come, so do what we tell you. There are 4 men with us who have made a vow. Take these men, join in the purification rites, and pay their expenses so they can have their heads shaved. Then everyone will know there is absolutely no truth in these reports about you, but that you yourself are living in obedience to the Torah. Now, this is Yeshua's half-brother, the chief of the Messianic Jewish community, saying this to Shaul. What's he telling him to do? There was a rumor going around. Rumor, by the way, is a lie, meaning that Shaul had abandoned the Torah and was teaching other Jews to do the same when he was in the diaspora teaching Messianic Jews there. So Yaakov and his elders request that Shaul take steps to exhibit that he is a Torah keeper. Now, if this was a ploy to win favor, it would have been disingenuous to do, correct? So were Yaakov and his elders disingenuous when they're asking Shaul to do this? Was Shaul disingenuous if and when he does this, and he did do it? In these instructions, and of course my answer is no. Yaakov and his elders were honest, real people, and Shaul as well. They're being genuine. They're doing this because it's the right thing to do according to the written Torah of Moshe, but even beyond it. Because in these instructions, Shaul's requested to pay the expenses of 4 Messianic Jews, 4 Jewish believers, who are ending a Nazarite vow. And we find all about Nazarite vows in Numbers chapter 6. This custom of what Shaul's asked to do. Shaul is somebody else who didn't take a vow. He's been asked to pay a person's expenses to break the vow. When you stopped the Nazarite vow, you had to offer offerings, and they were expensive for a typical person. So Shaul's asked to take some of the money that he had and to pay for these expenses for 4 people, which meant it would have been a considerable sum of money. Doing this is nowhere found in Scripture. In Numbers chapter 6, that talks about how to do a Nazarite vow. Nowhere is somebody else paying my expenses instructed to be done. This was a custom of late Second Temple period rabbis that was enacted by the rabbis. So Shaul is keeping, and these rabbis happen to be Pharisees, some of them Sadducees. Sadducees wouldn't have been considered rabbis. Anyhow, Pharisees and Sadducees. Shaul keeps a rabbinically enacted protocol here as he displays to everyone he's obedient to the Torah. And this touches on a couple of things we've talked about. Had he thrown the Torah away? Had he considered it garbage? If he thought rabbinic protocol, Pharisaic protocol, even beyond what the 5 books of Moses teach is garbage, he never would have done this. He'd be totally disingenuous. But he does it with a full heart because it's the right thing to do. And it will put to death the rumor that he pays no attention to the Torah. Now, part of this ceremony, again, includes offerings at the temple. So we can conclude this. Shaul showed his Torah obedience to all by doing this. And second, the rumor that he abandoned the Torah, meaning the 5 books of Moses and their instructions, was shown to be false. Now, some people will say, well, listen, Shaul also happened to stay with people on his journeys. And when he did that, surely he must have been doing things against the Torah, keeping a non-kosher diet, living in a non-kosher environment. He had to have been with the places you were in, people will say. Let's take a look at a couple of examples of this to show that thought or allegation also wouldn't be true. Shaul stayed in Lydia's home. You remember Lydia in the book of Acts chapter 16? She is mentioned in Greek as a sebameni ton theon. In other words, we talked about this term before, a God-fearer. God-fearers worship the God of Israel only in order to be in that category. They kept a kosher diet, They kept the Leviticus chapter 23 calendar and would have provided a ritually kosher environment for Shaul. So there's no problem with not living with another Torah-observant Jew when he's in Philippi. Let's read the text. One of those listening, this is from Acts chapter 16, verses 14 and 15. One of those listening was a woman from the city of Thyatira named Lydia, a dealer in purple cloth. She was a worshiper of God. That's our term, God-fearer above. Adonai, God, opened her heart to respond to Shaul's message. When she and the members of her household were immersed, she invited us to her home. If you consider me a believer in Messiah, she said, come and stay at my house. And she persuaded us. And this is 100% acceptable for Shaul to do because of her category as a God-fearer. Now let's look at the case of Timothy and what was proper halacha here, or proper religious, the proper carrying out of the instructions of the Torah in his case. Here's the situation. We read about it in Acts 16, 1, 2, and 3. Shaul came to Derbe and then to Lystra, where a student named Timothy lived, whose mother was Jewish and a believer, but whose father was a Greek. The believers at Lystra and Iconium spoke well of him. Shaul wanted to take him, meaning Timothy, along on the journey, so he circumcised him because of the Jews who lived in that area, for they all knew that his father was a Greek. Many of our commentators don't know what to do with this. They have no idea why Shaul did this. But remember, Shaul is a practicing mohel. He is a ritual circumciser. He's educated at that, as we talked about. He keeps proper religious protocol here by bringing Timothy formally and legally into the Jewish community. That is done by circumcision if you're a male. Timothy, his mother was Jewish and a believer, but whose father was Greek. That kind of a mix in the ancient world, in some communities, just having a Jewish mother is enough to make you technically Jewish. And in fact, today it is as well. However, technically, to make someone Jewish, if you're a male, you have to undergo the rite of circumcision to be brought into the covenant of Abraham, and then as well into that of Moses or Moshe. So let's go over why Shaul would have done this. The believers at Lystra and Iconium speak well of him. But Shaul wanted to take him along on the journey, and in order to do that, he circumcised him because of the Jewish communities in the area. Why? Timothy is half Jewish. And again, although he's considered Jewish then through his mother, if he's not circumcised, he's not considered a covenantally faithful Jew. An ancient Jewish community, which is where Shaul's traveling and sharing the good news, wouldn't listen to such a Jewish person because he's Jewish only by DNA, not by practice. And so him talking about the kingdom of God, Timothy, if it would have been known that he wasn't circumcised, people would wonder what's wrong with him. How can he talk about things of the kingdom of God when he ignores one of the basic instructions given to Jewish people about the kingdom of God? So Shaul circumcises him to bring him into the covenant of Abraham after Timothy's already a believer in Messiah. Okay, so this has nothing to do with opening the gates of eternal life for Timothy. It has to do everything with how he's living on earth and his calling. So to be a fully faithful Jewish man and to obey the Torah and to obey God fully, he's circumcised by Shaul. If Shaul thought that being Jewish and Jewish practices and the Torah of Moses was garbage, he never would have done this, but he does it. Just real quickly, we're going to go over some other things that Shaul did. You're not going to believe this. We've got 12 minutes left, and I'm only about halfway through this. So I'm going to try to summarize it really quickly, and then I'll take your questions. Okay, Shaul always kept the Sabbath during his travels. And there are some references for you, Acts 13:13, Acts 13:44, Acts 16:13, Acts 17:2. We don't have enough time to go over these scriptures. You can go over them at home. But it is written in the book of Acts that he went to synagogue according to his usual custom. And the word Iothos is used in Greek, meaning custom, which can also mean halakhic practice in his context. So he's fulfilling what's written every single Sabbath in Exodus chapter 20, verses 8 through 11, which calls on Jewish people to gather and have a holy assembly on this seventh day and to keep it and observe it and celebrate on it. Shaul is always doing that, thereby fulfilling what's written in the Torah. If he would have considered the Torah of Moshe and the instructions in it as garbage, he wouldn't have done that. Now, he also lives with Aquila and Priscilla. You might remember them in Corinth, who are two Jewish tent makers. Shaul also, being a master of that profession, lives with them and presumably took part in their business as he's staying in Corinth so he can pay his own expenses. Living with Aquila and Priscilla would have provided a kosher environment. We know Shaul's in Corinth for an entire year and a half. So let's take a look quickly at the first three verses of Acts chapter 18. And it'll show us that he had a kosher environment here. After this, Shaul left Athens and went to Corinth, where he met a Jewish man named Aquila. So Aquila is Jewish. Aquila and his wife Priscilla are already living according to the Torah, being Jews. He's originally from Pontus, but recently came with his wife Priscilla from Italy because Claudius, who was the Roman emperor, had issued a decree expelling all the Jews from Rome. Shaul went to see them, and because he had the same trade as they, making tents, he stayed on with them and they worked together. So he's living with them, working with them. He didn't stay the entire year and a half with them. He moved on to another place later on. He was in Corinth, but this gave him a totally kosher and Torah observant environment. So Shaul is not, during this time, straying from the Torah. In chapter 18, verse 7, he finishes his time living in Corinth with a man named Tedious Justus, who was a God-fearer again, a sebamenoton theon, which we've talked about before, and this too provided a kosher environment. Even when Shaul is in jail, there's no evidence that he ate food that would be against what's written in the law of Moshe to be eating in the Torah, nor that he violated Torah at all. And by the way, it's good for us to know its background information that in the first century, a Jewish prisoner, which Shaul was in Acts 16, was allowed to eat whatever was there in order to keep alive and healthy. So it was acceptable to eat unkosher food if that's all there was and you're rotting away in jail. However, Jewish communities had a custom to provide kosher food for known Jewish prisoners in Roman jails. And so if I knew there was a Jewish prisoner in my local jail, my Jewish community would provide him with kosher food, at least for the time that we're able to do so. So if you read Acts chapter 16, verses 23 to 40, we don't have time to do it, but this is where Shaul is in jail. He's with a jailer who ends up inviting Shaul and Silas to his home, and he feeds them. So people sometimes in their commentaries say, well, clearly he ate at a pagan's home, not a pagan anymore, he became a believer through what happened in the jail, but at a non-Jew's home, he must have eaten non-kosher. But listen, Shaul is Shaul. He knows what he can eat and what he can't, and I'm certain that he would have only eaten vegetables and or fruit at that time, or perhaps kosher fish, which all would have been acceptable for him. And the fact that he was beaten and certainly was suffering, he and his fellow Silas for that, may have qualified them anyhow, according to interpretation of that time period, to eat food that was non-kosher. But I'm going to guess that he didn't. Okay, so how can we look at what happened to Shaul? Here are my conclusions, friends. He did not leave his Jewish world. So what change took place? He received what he would have considered a prophetic calling from his Messiah. He didn't stop being Jewish or even a Pharisee, although again, we don't know officially how the Pharisees looked at him. He continued to strictly keep the Torah, as he states at the end of his life in Acts 28. Shaul couldn't have converted from Judaism to Christianity because there was no such thing as Christianity when he lived. The entire early movement of believers in Yeshua were considered by both the Romans and in Jewish communities as a Jewish movement within the Jewish world, who just happened to believe that this man, Yeshua, was the Messiah. Now, other people weigh in on Shaul's life, and I'll end with the slide, I think, after this one. I want to quote Pamela Eisenbaum, who is a professor of biblical studies in Denver, Colorado. Pamela is a conservative Jew. She's not a believer in Yeshua, but she's a good scholar. And here's what she says about him. Here are Jewish eyes of the 21st century looking at Shaul today. She's going to agree with me. Paul, she calls him. Paul's use of various Jewish labels is always in the present tense. He is a Hebrew. He is an Israeli. He is a descendant of Abraham. All these things are no less true of Paul as a follower of Yeshua than they were before his encounter with Yeshua. I love that quote in conclusion by a Jewish scholar. Kim Ambrose, who's a seminary instructor in the USA, who apparently I may have taught, oh, I saw a picture, I didn't remember her. But anyhow, here is what Kim says. His interpretation of the Bible is typical of Pharisaic interpretation in the first century. Yes, I totally agree. And here's what Rabbi Dan Cohen Sherbach, who lives in Wales and teaches in England, says, and he is a Reformed rabbi, but a very well-respected one and a good scholar. He says this: Paul's teaching and preaching are rooted in Pharisaic Judaism. So I totally agree with these voices, and certainly you know that by what I've said here. So how does Shaul's background affect his letters? We don't have time to go into this, but you have the rest of your lives to study his writings, and I hope what I've laid as his background will help you read his letters correctly. First of all, it should affect his letters, shouldn't it? Secondly, we'd expect to see Shaul's writings reflect his background and not deny it. Thirdly, we would then expect his letters to never contradict having a love for the Torah and practicing the Torah. And we would expect that his letters would always uphold the Acts chapter 15 decisions. Why? I brought this out in the beginning of the talk today, that Shaul was a sent representative. In Hebrew, we say shaliach. In Greek, the word is apostolos, or apostle in English. Who sent him? Who sent Shaul off on his journeys? Who sponsored him? Who backed him? Who was praying for him? He was always a part of the flagship Jerusalem-based Messianic Jewish community led by Yaakov, Yeshua's half-brother. They're the people who sent him. And we see that again in Acts chapter 21, which is Shaul's last time period ever spent in Israel. The first thing he does when he arrives in Israel is not take 3 or 4 days off from his long journeys and rest up and enjoy the beach at Caesarea like we would today. The first thing he does, the next morning after he arrives, he goes and consults with Yaakov. Why? Yaakov's his elder. Yaakov's the one whose community sent him. He represents them, and he carries out the decisions that community made in Acts chapter 15 everywhere he went. In fact, I would argue that the book of Galatians, which is often used to say that Shaul didn't believe in the Torah anymore, the book of Galatians is simply Shaul teaching about the Acts 15 decisions in the context of what was going on in Galatia. That would take another 2-hour class to talk about. But at least you've got my take on that. Okay, last slide here. Shaul is representative of the Messianic Jewish community of Jerusalem. We see proof of that in Acts 16, verse 4. It says, as they traveled from town to town, they, meaning Shaul and his companions, delivered the decisions reached by the apostles and elders in Jerusalem. That's that first flagship Messianic Jewish community, for the people to obey. So Shaul still saw himself as a representative of Yaakov, of Peter, and of Yochanan or John's community. They were the 3 pillars brought up in Acts chapter 15. And this is the tie that cemented him to the Jewish world of the land of Israel. Okay, I have so many more. But we just don't have time. So I'm going to end now and take your questions, okay? Let me just get where I can see all of you. And we'll do that. Whoops, don't have the view I want. Well, go ahead anyhow. If you have a question or comment, and what time are we at? Oh, good. Okay, so we'll take 15 or 20 minutes. Okay, that's about all I can spare right now. But if you have a comment or question, please unmute yourself and speak up.
Hello, thank you for that, David. Rabbi Freeman, that's excellent. I just have a question regarding Shaul.
Sure.
So if he was a classmate of Shimon ben Gamliel, and he's considered a sage and is quite well written within the Pekah Vote, is there any writing regarding Shaul as a character within the Jewish writing, or does he exist in any Jewish writing as a sage?
Nope, not at all, nothing. But that might not surprise us because there's very little written in the Talmud, say, which is our major work of the rabbis from that time period, very little written about Yeshua. There are a couple of things, one in a positive light, and I think 3 in a negative light, and that's it. Okay. So if they don't write about him, they're not going to write much about Shaul. He appears to have been maybe given the cold shoulder in terms of inclusion at that point in anything that was happening in that arena.
Another question I have is, how
Please.
old do you think Shaul was when he died, roughly?
I'm going to guess anywhere up to age 65.
55.
So 65. So he could have been 62, 63, 64, 65, somewhere there.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome. Anybody else? If you have any questions, please unmute yourself. If you're unmuted right now and not speaking, would you mind muting yourself? That way I won't get reverb in my ears so I can hear the person asking the question.
I have a question.
Can you hear me?
Oh. Yeah. Oh, wait, I hear 2 people now.
Okay.
Go ahead.
I have a question, and that is concerning the part where you were talking about the contemporary to his studies, Shaul under Gamliel. He would have become familiar with parts of the Gemara. And I understand that the Gemara, the commentary, was written, I believe, by Judah Hanassi, which is...
no, that would be the Mishnah, but you're right. It's even later than the Mishnah.
That's correct. But the Gemara is a commentary on the Mishnah.
Correct. So it's even later in the 5th or 6th century.
So it has to be later. So what are you saying that, how would he have been? Because since he's a contemporary of Shimon ben Gamliel, and Judah Hanassi, I think, is a son of Shimon ben Gamliel.
Yes.
So then that would make it so that it was not written yet. If the Mishnah was not written yet, there was no...
Right.
But the Talmud does that a lot, that it's anachronic.
Plays with generations, right.
Exactly.
Well, okay, so I think the best way to look at this is that Gemara, as used when it's written in the Mishnah, the word doesn't mean the same thing as we define it today. Today we define the Gemara as a body of commentary on the Mishnah written by a certain set of rabbis. Obviously those rabbis hadn't lived yet, and the Gemara as what it is today as we read the Talmud wasn't even in existence. So by using the word Gemara in the Mishnah, it's referring to the latest commentaries that were probably oral at the time and hadn't been written down, having to do with either subjects on the Mishnah or commenting somewhere in the world there. It's not well defined for us. So, but you're right, we cannot say this is the Gemara that we have today that comments on the Mishnah. So it's just some other type of rabbinic commentary, probably again oral, on some of the teachings of the sages of the Mishnah, but not written down. And even if we say Mishnah, we only have, the first well, more than that. We have maybe 2/3 of the people quoted in the Mishnah who are alive by the time that Shaul had died. Maybe 2/3, maybe less.
Yes. Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
I unmute myself now for the others.
No problem. Anyone else with a question or comment? Somebody else was waiting to say.
Yeah. I have a question.
Please.
Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, you're buzzing. I'm not quite sure why.
Yeah, I don't know why.
Okay.
I have been reading about Seneca, and there was a rumor that there was letters between Seneca and Paul.
Yeah.
I just want to know what do you think about if that has been the case or not, and was Seneca around? Do you think Paul was influenced at all by Seneca?
I am absolutely not an expert on that question, so I can't give you an intelligent answer. I can just give you my opinion, which is I've never seen any proof of it. So I would tend to say no until some proof is found.
Okay. Okay, thanks.
Sure, you're very welcome. Nice
So I
to
would
hear
like
you, by
to,
the way. Please.
yeah, this is Joseph Pawar from India. I
Hi.
want to first of all thank you so much. One of the thoughts that has been clear now for me, especially from Philippians chapter 3, verses 7 to 8, which you have well clarified. We always had difficulty in understanding when Paul says, things that I have learned or I knew. Now I consider it as a garbage. That garbage word is like very difficult to say because man who was studied at the feet of Gamliel, and then he says, I consider it nothing, or I just do it. And actually, I want to thank you because that was not true. You have brought a very different perspective, from my thinking, and I understand what he meant by saying or writing in chapter 3, verse 7 years. So I'm clear now of the word that I want to do. I consider everything a loss because of surpassing worth of knowledge and knowing Christ Jesus, my Lord, for whose sake I have lost all things. And so he didn't lose Torah, he didn't lose his roots. He was a very strong Jew, man who followed practice the Jewish custom, and along with that, a noble task that he took, which he mentioned, of being a priest to the world, bringing Gentiles to one God. I am so thankful to you for this wonderful revelation that you have brought in. We in India, especially those who are tied up with Jewish Torah, in Torah, we've been sometimes accused of, we go back to Old Testament and things like that. But now I really have something that is, which you have brought in. I want to thank you so much.
You're very welcome. Unfortunately, I didn't hear the beginning of what you said. You were kind of fading in and out, but I caught the end. And thank you for joining us, first of all. And you're very welcome, Joseph. Joseph, this had any positive meaning for you, I'm very happy.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you so much.
Shalom. Can I ask you a question, please?
Please.
I'm Karina Chandra from India. I just wanted to ask you, according to Ephesians 2:14, breaking down of the wall of separation, Christians say that Paul meant that the law was done away with. So what did he actually mean?
Okay, so I don't think the wall of separation is the Torah. It can't be, because that would contradict how he lived and then what he teaches in Romans chapter 3, chapter 9, chapter 10, chapter 11. it just couldn't be that. So there were things that, okay, first of all, he's writing to the Ephesians. So we have to put it into context of what was happening in Ephesus at the time. And a couple of things come to my mind. First of all, I don't have a quick answer for this, but a couple of things come to my mind. One is that he could be talking about the way that people were living could cause separation if they don't understand correctly how they should be living. So for example, we find in Corinthians that a lot of questions are asked to Shaul about, is it okay to do this or do that? And he's answering, no, you have to do this or that. So this is probably going on in Ephesus as well. And I'm guessing that there were some things happening there that were causing some believers to be shunned by others. I don't know if there was a problem with Jewish believers and non-Jewish believers, but it wouldn't, the Torah would not have been the issue. Okay, and some people will say, okay, well, he's referring to the temple here. I've heard commentators say that. I don't know if he is, but if he is, then again, the Torah wouldn't be our problem here. The problem would be perhaps some of the concepts that people have that Gentiles shouldn't be able to enter into the full worship of God, say as Jews can at the temple. And possibly Shaul was referring to the barrier that there was a waist-high barrier at the temple that kept non-Jews out of the inner courts, but just allowed them to be at the outer courts. Some commentators saying he's referring to that as the barrier that Yeshua took down. But if Yeshua took it down, it's in a spiritual sense, meaning that Gentile believers now have absolutely the same access as any Jewish believer would to God, but it's through the Messiah. It won't happen at the temple courts. He could be referring to that. I don't know. But the one thing I do know is he's not referring to the Torah, because that would not fit his life and the rest of his teachings. Is that helpful at all? You're very welcome. Anybody else with a comment?
Okay, I have a real, did you want to talk first? Go ahead. I don't know.
Oh, thank you. Please go ahead.
Okay,
Nope.
it's just a real quick, probably a stupid question, but
No stupid questions.
I'm confused. You said that Shaul was a classmate of Gamliel, but yet he's also his teacher.
No.
So
No. Shimon ben Gamliel would have been his classmate.
Shimon, and then the father is, what's his name? The father?
Gamliel.
Gamliel.
But he's not Shimon. He's not the elder Gamliel. Okay. Okay.
It's very possible I said it wrong or that you understood it wrong. Either way, we clarified it now.
That's all I wanted to know.
Go ahead, Steve.
I would ask something about Shaul, also known as Shaul, that in his, he chose to take the vocation of being a tent maker and support himself and to sustain his integrity as a teacher by not taking and living off the tithes and so on.
Yes.
So is there a tradition in that or that I don't know about, that he chose to make his living, as well as in all his efforts and all his struggles and all of his teaching, and it seems like so much he took on himself. Was there a tradition in doing that, a precedent that I don't know about? Or was it something he just self-imposed?
I don't know about any tradition, but I do know he explains it a couple of times where he said that he was, a shaliach, an apostle, and he had the right to ask people to support him, but he chose not to, in order to demonstrate to them that he loved them and he was not taking advantage of them. I think it's in 2 Corinthians he mentions that. So that apparently is his motivation for doing that. And you're right, he was very consistent in doing that.
Yeah.
He did collect a rather large sum of money on his last trip, and he brings it back, and he didn't take it for himself. Part of that was spent on paying the 4 people's Azerite Vow.
Azerite vows, yeah.
But he brought it back for believers who were going through some kind of famine here in the land. He mentions that.
And I can make a comment on that. If I could make a comment on that is what he ended up being in prison for, of course, and beheaded for, all in trying to prove that he was a keeper of Torah. and it's
It was connected in there, that's for sure. Yeah.
Adjacent to that question, I would wonder if you throw any light on what tent making really was. Some people have said it was the making of talits, and do you know anything about that, David?
No, I've always taken that literally, that he literally made tents. As you know, tents were quite common in the ancient world. People for setting up in marketplaces for businesses or whatever, as well as is right in an agora marketplace. You could have tent structures. Here in Israel, we tended to have stone and wood, but
Yeah.
but I don't know. Maybe it can make that. It's worthwhile looking at. I mean, some funny things have happened with discovering usages of terms. This is totally irrelevant to our discussion, but Yeshua's father is a carpenter, and he's a carpenter. They're described in those terms in the 4 histories of Yeshua's life. And we do know that a slang term carpenter is used in the Talmud from that time period, meaning a Torah scholar. And it just makes people wonder, I wonder if there's a double meaning in calling him that. Not only did they work with wood, but they also studied a lot of Torah, the 2 of them. Whatever, the sons of the family. I mean, it would certainly seem so. That would fit, right?
Yeah.
And it's just very interesting that we're just discovering today that a lot of words and terms had double meanings.
Yeah. Well, thank you.
You're welcome. Somebody else had a question. Shachar, was it you?
Yes, Ken.
Okay.
Thank you so much to Rabbi David for this.
Sure.
My question is, at some point, I would love to hear a teaching connecting what you said about Galatians and Acts 15.
Oh.
An elaboration of how Shaul took this decision of Acts 15 into Galatians, and then expounding upon that in the. I think that was excellent.
It is. It's really helpful because the book of Galatians is most often kind of a book that I think is misunderstood totally in terms of what its purpose was. And it's made oftentimes to contradict what we read in Acts 28:17. So I'm going to just summarize real quickly. Maybe I'll give another seminar sometime on the book of Galatians. But the book of Galatians is basically written to Shaul's students in Galatia, where he had spent some time laying a foundation for their community. And there were a group of traveling teachers apparently who came. We don't even know if these teachers were Jewish. Mark Nanos, an American scholar, has done some work on that. He wrote a 1,000-page book on the book of Galatians, which is just a masterpiece. And he would tend to agree with what I'm going to say now, which is this. We don't know if they were Jewish. And whatever concept they had of what the Torah was wrong. So they're teaching a wrong concept of what the Torah was to the people in Galatians. Shaul finds out about this, and it infuriates him. And he writes Galatians trying to set them straight. So that's the context. He's not telling them that the Torah is bad. He's not telling them the Torah is been cast away by Yeshua. He's telling them the way now that they're keeping the Torah is contradicting everything that Yeshua stood for. Okay, so he's telling them you're keeping the Torah wrong. Not that you shouldn't keep it. They should keep it, but keep it right the way that our Messiah taught us to. How were they keeping it that was wrong? And that's where we have to do a lot of work in reconstructing what was going on there. But from Shaul's arguments, we can do some. I can tell you maybe just 2 things, and then we'd have to go on for 2 hours. But one of them is that in the keeping of the Torah, they were doing it in such a way that they were trying to influence what was going to happen in the next life. So in other words, they're keeping the Torah trying to gain more favor in the life to come. That's their main purpose for keeping it. And Shaul gets very incensed at that. He wants them to understand that their situation in the life to come is decided and has been decided by their belief in Yeshua and their proper keeping of the Torah. If you start keeping the Torah in such a way that that you're using it to determine whether you gain eternal life or not, then, Shaul is saying, oh my goodness, you haven't understood the most basic thing I was trying to teach you. So that's number one. Apparently that problem was going on. And then secondly, one thing these Torah teachers were doing was trying to undermine the authority of Shaul, but let's trace Shaul back to the flagship Messianic Jewish community in Jerusalem. These teachers did not accept the Acts 15 decisions, and they're trying to impose much more on the community in Galatia than the Acts 15 decisions decided should happen. And so Shaul is in a power struggle against these other teachers for having the shaliach or apostles role in Galatia. And Galatia is not a city. It's an area of Turkey. So we're talking about a number of congregations that are at stake here. So the stakes were high. And that's why Shaul is fighting so hard in the letter of Galatians. And again, why he uses the word Torah, but we have to be careful which Torah is it. Are we talking the Torah of Moses or the false Torah that these teachers are teaching? And my assertion is that most often that's what he's talking about. I hope that helps.
Yes, it does. Thank you very much.
Okay. You're welcome. By the way, where are you located? In Israel, I take it.
Yerushalayim.
Oh, you're one of us.
Yes.
Nice to meet you. I don't think we've met before, but I recall.
I don't think so either, but it's a pleasure to meet you.
You as well. Nemo. Anyone else? I can handle probably one or two more before I collapse.
Can I just follow on with a question about circumcision?
Please.
So in the chapter Acts 15 with the Council of Jerusalem, they were basically debating about circumcisions amongst the Gentiles, and it's not about a salvation issue here.
Right.
And so they concluded there were 4 things to do. So it's just interesting that then going on to chapter 16, that Paul then decides to circumcise Timothy. I know that that's not a salvation issue. So can you, just taking that into modern day life today, what's your view on circumcisions amongst the believers to Gentile converts into Messiah?
Well, here again, I want to emphasize that the only reason Shaul does this is because Timothy is Jewish, and Timothy wants to identify as a Jew, and he wants to live as a Jew, and he wants to share the good news amongst his people. And the only way that he could validly do that is if he is circumcised, because according to the Jewish communities out there, where Timothy was, but as well worldwide at the time, and even today, if a male is not circumcised, he hasn't taken the first step into entering obedience to the Torah. So Timothy wants to teach that Yeshua is the Messiah prophesied about in the Torah. He really has to be circumcised to do it. Otherwise, one could just shoot back, what authority do you have to teach me, a Torah observant Jew, about the Torah when you, a Jew, don't keep the Torah? See the problem Timothy would have? And he would have that. And so Shaul is just taking the action that's preventative to prevent that problem from happening. But as well, he's writing something that was wrong. What's wrong? According to the book of Bereshit or Genesis, as well as according to the Torah of Moshe, every Jewish male is supposed to be circumcised. And again, it's not an issue of belief in the Messiah. It's an issue of how a Jew is supposed to live coming from God's own mouth. So it's an issue of obedience to God. It's like keeping kosher. Let's put it this way. Excuse me a second. If I am trying to share my belief in Yeshua with people here in Jerusalem where I live, and I'm seeing at non-kosher restaurants eating pork every day, nobody is going to believe me. No one's going to listen to me because I've been breaking the Torah, and they've seen it, and they will say, what do you, a Jew who's trying to tell me about Yeshua, on what authority do you do it when you don't live according to the Torah that you say Yeshua is, prophesied about there? You don't have any right to tell me about him if you're not living according to the way we're supposed to be living. Or it'd be like a police officer who arrests somebody But the police officer is constantly breaking the law, speeding everywhere he goes, arresting people without reading them their rights, doesn't do what his boss tells him to do, does what he wants to do. He should have no one's going to listen to him. I mean, he's going to have problems. And Timothy would too if he didn't get circumcised. So you see, it's really it's a legal issue, and it's an issue of identification. If Timothy wanted to live as a Gentile, then he wouldn't have to get circumcised. If Timothy wanted to stay where he was in Derbe, or Lystra, I guess it was, and never share amongst Jews or live as a Jew, but adopt more or less his father's family, as the people he wanted to live in. If being Jewish meant nothing to him, then he wouldn't have to get circumcised. But it meant something to him. And he had received a calling to share with his own flesh and blood kinsmen from his mother's side of the family, according to what Timothy must have felt. And so he finds Shaul and follows Shaul, and Shaul makes the right decision. In the case of Titus, who was another student of Shaul, Titus happened to be a Gentile. And so Shaul writes, and he goes, he's not going to circumcise Titus. Titus is sharing with Jewish people, but he's sharing as a Gentile. So there's no need to circumcise him. But Timothy there was, because he was sharing with his people from the midst of his people. And the only way he could do that was as a Torah faithful Jew. And the only way he could be a Torah faithful Jew was to right the step that had been ignored when he was a baby.
Okay, thank you.
Sure, you're very welcome. One more question.
No question, but I want to say thank you. I'm Philippa from Germany. I'm a member of TGC2 Germany.
Oh, great.
I just love your lecture. Thank you so much. And it was such a, I don't know how to say it, but thank you, Danke from Germany.
Bitte schön. Where are you from? Where are you living in Germany?
I live in Wallhausen. It's near Frankfurt.
Okay, so ich geboren in Stuttgart.
Oh.
I was born in Germany, I'm telling her.
Thank you.
So thank you for joining us, Philippa. It's great to see you. Well, I'm going to close off. If anybody has any further questions or comments, you can always stay online a little bit later. We'll ask Bracha to keep us up a little bit later, and put your question down on the chat here, and I'll come back in a few minutes and try to pay attention to them. Okay? Thank you for joining me. I hope this has been helpful. I mean, my hope and the reason I do this is because my heart is for us to understand the scriptures. I think if we can understand them, we have a good foundation for our lives. If we don't understand them, our lives are going to be lacking. And they're already lacking so much just because we're people, and we're people living in the 21st century with all of our pressures. We're living in a world that's right now having an incredible amount of serious problems. We need to have a good foundation in the scripture to stand for what our presents and what our futures are going to look like. And I'm very happy that all of you tuned in, and I just hope that this just is a little iota of helping to help you understand the scriptures a little bit. You've then made my day. So thanks for joining.
Thank you, Rabbi, for the wonderful word. We were really blessed, learned a lot from it. Thanks a lot. We'll like to join some more of your sessions if you permit us.
Oh, of course you can. Thank you, Karina, for coming. So I'll say bye-bye.
Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Toda Rabba.
Bakasha. Toda Dali.
Toda Rabba.
Toda.
Shalom. Thank you, Pastor Rabbi, for the teaching.
You're welcome.
If anyone would like some more information about our congregation, we meet every Shabbat, and Rabbi David teaches on the Torah portion of the week. I put an email into the chat section, and you can send us an email and we'll send you more information. So there was a question if we're going to continue on the subject focusing on how Shaul specifically taught Torah. We can give that suggestion to Rabbi David. Maybe he will be willing to do another teaching seminar to go deeper into that. I think that would be amazing, but I'll make sure that he gets that information. Thank you, Dolly. And also, I recorded the teaching today. So if you want a recording, it seems that Dolly seems to be a good point person for all our friends that we just met in India. So Dolly, please feel free to forward the recording when it's posted on to everyone.
Yeah, that would be brilliant. Thank you so much, Bracha.
You're welcome.
Will you be sending it via email or will you be sending it on the Torah chat?
I usually send it on the Torah chat, and you can copy it there and send an email out if you need to.
Sure. Yeah, that would be great. I prefer WhatsApp actually. Yeah.
Philippa, it's such a blessing to see you. So glad you were here. Rachel, I can't hear you for some reason. I still don't, you sound like you're in another room. I apologize, I can't hear you.
Can you hear me?
Yes, thank you so much. I can hear you now.
Okay. Where is the Torah chat that you're talking about?
The Torah chat is in connection with the Darchei congregation, Darchei Noam.
Yeah.
So
where do we find that?
If you would like to be on the Torah chat, that's where we talk about the Torah portion of the week. I can add you to that.
Okay.
I think I already have your phone number because I send you WhatsApp messages, right?
I think I'm pretty sure we've been in communication before.
Okay, so I'll add you to the Torah chat. It's just a place where people can express what is going on in their heart regarding the Torah portion of the week. And especially after David's teaching, you know, there's a lot more conversation that goes on in the Torah chat.
Bracha, there were some people who were interested in joining the Torah chat. Is it okay to have them part of it?
Yes, please send me their phone numbers for WhatsApp, and I'll put them into the Torah chat.
Sure. Okay. Yeah. Thank you so
So
much.
I'm making a note to add Rachel and Winnie, and then Dolly will send me whoever else wants to be on there.
Sure. I think Karina and Nikki Chandra wanted to be on it. Karina and Nikki Chandra.
And who?
Karina.
Okay, great.
Husband.
That's great. Just send me their information, their phone number.
Yeah, sure. And Winnie wanted to as well. So Winnie is you've already included Winnie. Yeah.
Okay, I'm gonna go. Thank you. Bye.
You're welcome. Bye, Rachel.
Bye. See
Bye.
you. Take care.
Bye, Dolly.
Bye, everyone.
Bye, Barbara.
Thank you for joining us.
Bye, Winnie.
Bracha, what time is the Shabbat teaching on the portion? You said it's every Shabbat. What time is it in Israel time?
Israel time, it's at 12 noon, and it goes for about 2 hours.
Right. And it's on Zoom, like now?
It's on Zoom right now. We're going to transition back to meeting in person but that's going to take a while. And that's only going to be once a month that we actually meet in person. We're going to ease into it. So, but we will continue to broadcast on Zoom even when we meet in person.
Oh, brilliant.
Oh, brilliant. Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah.
Thank you. That's really good.
Okay, bye. See you. Take care.
Bye, Dolly.
Bye.
So I think we're waiting for Rabbi David to come back, but I see that some of the people who asked questions already left. And I see that, Ma'ayan, you have a question about Luke being a Gentile convert. Bye, Marie. So we'll wait and see for Rabbi David to come back.
Yeah. I want to say also hi, bracha.
Hi,
Again,
Ma'ayan. Oops, let me turn this off. My dog is barking. Go.
Yeah. Hi, Nessie. I just got back a few days ago from Eilat, and I'm recuperating from that. You know, a whole vacation with the family and the grandkids. But I'm back on the wagon.
What does that mean?
On track.
Yes, I was wondering. I noticed you were quite tan.
I know, I'm a sunburned. I'm also peeling, if you can see there. I'm peeling pretty bad. I got sunburned. The heat in Eilat is really, really bigger than I've ever encountered. We were at 107 degree on the beach, you know, but we did some snorkeling with dolphins. And
so Ma'ayan, I
yeah.
think what you can do is post your question on the Torah chat.
Yeah.
And that way, you know, when Rabbi David has time, he can answer the question. That might be the better way to do it. And that way, everyone who's on Torah chat can benefit from the answer.
The only thing is that it's to post the question without background is kind of complicated.
Well, if he knows, if you can tell him in regarding your seminar today on Shaul,
yeah,
I have a question, and just your one sentence. It's a one sentence question. I see
right.
that you wrote.
Yeah,
well, so he'll know. He'll know what you're talking about.
It's hard to put in a one sentence because you have to evaluate Luke's writings, and there's some people who don't think that he was a non-Jew. And there is a debate going on, and because he has such knowledge of the priestly things, he had some connections with priestly families, and his writing was in a very, very good Greek, and he was a doctor. And I mean, aside from the fact of possibly thinking that he was a doctor a Gentile doctor. We know a lot of Jews become doctors, but a Gentile doctor working in a priestly family, possibly. How could he know so many things that only the priestly families knew? And also only the priestly families had a very good education in Greek.
So Rabbi David, there's one question for you that's pending.
So was he from a Jewish priestly family, or was he a servant in the Jewish priestly family? And who is Theophilus? Who is Theophilus, the one he writes to? Who is supposed to be, Theophilus was a name that was used. It means friend of God, and it was a name that was used for a lot among the priestly families as well. There are some histories of Theophilus there. So I don't know. I have some questions concerning that. I don't know. Did you hear everything I said?
Hold on just a moment. Rabbi David, I'm going to log off, but both Maayan and Winnie have questions for you. So I'm going to let you answer those. And I'm going to just kind of mute myself, but I won't be at my computer.
No problem. You deserve a break. Okay, so I'm looking here.